When I was 20 years old, so about 6 years ago, I worked as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift ended up getting fired due to him losing his license because of a DUI, I was placed on the night shift instead, since my boss hired a family friend who could only work my shift for whatever reason. I really didn't want this shift because you never know if people who order late at night actually want a pizza or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss was an asshole and essentially told me if I wasn't willing to work the night shift, I would be immediately fired. I wasn't in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly decided to work that shift. The first month of this shift actually went by without any issues, at least until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punch it in on my GPS. The house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. When I arrived, it was about 11 p.m. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses, but the house I delivered to was a duplex. I ring the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and waited another 30 seconds. Still no answer. I'm standing there getting pretty nervous that something's about to go down, but thankfully a man then opened the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 feet tall, and was very skinny. I told him his pizza was there, and he just stood there staring at me. Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine, sorry. I just got off work not too long ago, and I've been zoning out a bit." "Fair enough, I suppose." He hands me over the money. I hand him over the pizza. As I'm making change, he says, "You're really beautiful. You know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight, and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the night. A few days later, I get a delivery order to the same place. I head over there around the same time as last time and ring the doorbell. He answers the door very excitedly this time. "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and couldn't wait to go home, which he chuckled to and said, "I know the feeling pretty well," as he was pulling out his wallet. As he was counting his money, he asked me what my name was. Being kind of tired at this point and not really thinking straight, I stupidly told him my real name. As I'm making change, he asked if he could have my number. "I'd love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as you are." Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I'd literally only met this guy twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who he was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is that I looked way younger than I was at the time. I was often told by numerous people that I still looked like I was 15 years old. I was hoping he thought differently and wasn't hitting on what he thought was a teenager. I was just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds before I mustered out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He got very upset. We stood there in silence before I told him to have a good night and walked back to my car. He said nothing, still standing at the doorway staring at me, until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy, and even brought it up to my coworkers. They agreed it was pretty creepy, except for my boss who overheard everything and claimed I was making up stories and trying to gain sympathy for having to take that shift. What a fucking asshole. A week later, as I'm working the night shift, we get an order from the same guy again, and this is when shit actually hits the fan. I arrive at the house at around 10:30. Keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in that house was on. I quickly got out of my car and walked to the front door with the pizza box in my arms. As I'm on my approach, the door quickly swings open to reveal the man, except this time he's wearing a suit. I jump back, startled. "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you coming out the window and figured I'd just open the door now, so you wouldn't have to ring the bell." I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in the whole house. He was just sitting in the dark this whole time? If so, why? I nervously laughed and said it was okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said yes. He then asked me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" What the fuck? Once again, I told him I had a boyfriend, to which he chuckled, got close to me, and said, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabbed the pizza box from me and threw it on the ground, then grabbed me by my arms hard. I was officially shitting bricks at this point, trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I actually started pleading with him. "Dude, please, I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He stared at me with the most sinister look I've ever seen on someone's face. "I don't care. Get inside now. We're gonna have a good time." He started trying to pull me into the house. I was resisting as hard as I could. After a bit of struggling, he let go of one of my arms and started grabbing something out of his pocket, which I guessed was a knife. I did something that to this day I'm still thankful worked as he was doing that. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in his stomach. This stunned him for a few seconds and loosened his grip on me, allowing me to break free. I quickly ran to my car. Just as I get in, he tries pulling me out of it, holding a knife in the other hand. "Why are you making this so difficult?" I grabbed a half-empty soda bottle I had in the cup holder and threw it. Luckily, it smacked him right in the face and he let me go out of startlement. I slammed the door. All of a sudden, he jumped right on the hood of my car and started scratching and banging on my windshield with his knife. I threw the car in reverse and quickly backed out of the spot. I reversed down the road with him desperately trying to hold on to my car. He's slamming on my hood, screaming, "Stop the fucking car!" I turn onto the next road as quickly as possible. Luckily, he falls off the hood. I slammed the gas as hard as I could to get away from that sick bastard. In my panic state, I drove a couple of blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto the other side blocks as I feared I was going to be followed. Eventually, I reached a red light and slammed on the brakes and just sat there at that intersection frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was sitting there. It dawned on me I had just come so close to losing my life, and I couldn't help but feel like I shouldn't even be alive right now. Once the light turned green, I pulled over to the side and just sat there crying. Eventually, I got the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walked in, my coworker knew something was wrong after seeing me. I practically broke down in front of him, and everyone else came to the front wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that had just happened. My coworker comforted me, and my boss actually surprised me and began apologizing profusely for what had happened and for ever putting me on the night shift in the first place. He took me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrived at the store and I gave them my statement, as well as taking pictures of any marks on myself, as well as the scratches on my car from the encounter as evidence. My coworker followed behind me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed. Strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep quite easily. I quit my job the next day, and luckily a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at a clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later I received an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife. The psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I had learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly, at first for robberies and assaults, but later on for sex crimes. He had been released from jail just about 5 months prior to this encounter for having sex with a minor. When they arrived at the house, he was long gone, and his family had no idea where he ran off to. The police insisted they would find him. They did, albeit not alive. I spent the next 2 months in fear that he would find me and finish what he had in mind, but the police kept contact and updated me quite frequently on the case. Apparently, he fled to another city nearby and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking alone late at night on the street. Luckily, somebody happened to be looking out the window at the right time, called the cops, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. He managed to flee from the scene and the police chased after him. He blew a red light near a busy boulevard and a van slammed into the driver's side of his car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries, while the psycho succumbed to his wounds long before the ambulance even arrived. I thanked the officers for everything they did and for informing me, and I walked out of the station. I walked down the street and I lit up a cigarette as I'm taking in everything I've just been told. I don't wish death on people, but after hearing about his death, I felt very relieved. I felt very relieved he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved I would never have to encounter him ever again, and that I wouldn't have to go through with charging him and reliving what happened that night. My last experience 2 years before this was scary, but I think this one takes the cake as being the scariest. I was alone and face to face with this psycho. Who knows where I'd be if he managed to pull me into his house. A few years ago, I got transplanted from a really cold climate to a really hot one. I was used to winters with snowstorms that produced several feet worth of snow, while not shutting down any schools or businesses. I now live in an area where if the ground even frosts over, everything shuts down. No one can drive, there's a panic where everyone buys out all the bread, milk, and toilet paper from all the local stores too. So around the second winter that I lived there, something really interesting happened that hasn't ever happened since. We were set to have this real nasty snowstorm. As expected, it was really crazy and hectic during the day, as the snowstorm was supposed to hit that night. And boy, when that storm hit, it did not disappoint. It was a hard falling snow which quickly began building up on the ground. Of course, by that point, the town had become a ghost town, but I really didn't care. I wasn't planning on going out in the storm, I was just going to enjoy it from home. The worst part, and I guess I should have expected this to happen, was when the power went out. After that, I knew it was going to be a while before it came back on. This meant I really didn't have much to entertain myself with. I decided I would go and take a walk and see how extensive this power outage really was. I still had all of my belongings from when I lived in a colder climate. So I had the proper boots, a thick coat, and a bunch of hats. I would be able to get around quite easily and keep as warm as I needed to be. I wasn't about to drive though because the roads were not salted, and it didn't seem like any plows were out working quite yet. I walked around my neighborhood. It looked like everything was out. It was so dark outside too because all of the street lamps were out as well. There was absolutely no one outside other than me, which was exactly what I had expected. I would have absolutely nothing to do if I just went back home, so I decided it wouldn't hurt to walk into town and see how things were going down there. I figured there was a better chance that some of the lights and such would still be on down there. There's this bridge that you have to go over to get into town. It's right over a train tunnel, and I found out before that a lot of homeless people tend to live under the bridge because it's the coolest place in the summertime, and the only place they can be protected from the elements. I had never seen any homeless people in the town though, so up until that point I didn't know if it was true or not. While I was approaching the bridge on the left side of it, I thought I noticed someone walking up the hill on the other side. As dark as it was, I couldn't quite be sure of it at first, but as I got closer to the bridge, there was definitely someone who was walking on the opposite side from me. Now, it's not always scary to see someone out walking at night as often as we think it is. Actually, I get more scared when I'm walking around never seeing anyone. Whenever I do see someone, I generally feel a sense of relief that I'm not alone anymore. For some reason though, when I noticed this guy, that's not what I was feeling at that moment. I actually started feeling a little bit nervous. At least he was on the other side of the bridge though. I felt there was no reason to be nervous as long as he was. After I got to the other end of the bridge, I was able to see into town, and when I did, I noticed it was completely dark there too. There was 1 or 2 stores that looked like they had lights on, probably from portable generators. I should have just let my curiosity be filled at that point and turned back home. I began thinking though about the possibly homeless guy across the road. I was wearing a pretty heavy coat, and I thought it was likely he didn't have anything like that to keep him warm. I decided I would try and do a good thing and cross over to the street and offer him my coat. I started crossing over, which was a little bit difficult because it was more slippery than the sidewalks were. I did almost slip and fall a couple of times, but I managed to hold myself up. Well, when I got over to the guy, he obviously noticed me. I asked him if he needed a coat to try and keep himself warm. When he turned to look at me, I finally got a really good look at his face. He was torn up badly. He had cuts all over him and was holding his right arm as if it were shattered. He looked absolutely horrible. "Get the fuck back here!" I heard from a third person yelling behind us. Turning, I saw another man walking slowly toward us. It took a moment for me to put two and two together and realize that this new guy must have been the guy who had caused all these injuries in the first place. The injured guy tried to move off, and for the first time I noticed he was limping as well. The new guy tried to shove past me, and I noticed he had a knife on him. It was all very overwhelming. "How dare you try to take my fucking blanket?" the new guy screamed after the first guy. "I didn't." The injured guy wailed and tried desperately to get away. I was shocked, but I knew I had to do something or I might just be sitting here watching him get killed. I moved in close to the new guy and pushed him as hard as I could. Since it was so snowy and slippery out like I mentioned, the guy fell hard and then slid down the hill. I took out my smartphone and called 911 immediately. The guy, it seemed, was having a lot of trouble getting back up and wasn't able to before the police eventually arrived actually. By that point, I had already given the injured guy my coat, and they had gotten an ambulance for him as well. The attacker got arrested. Turned out both were homeless guys who lived under that bridge. I really have no idea what might have happened, but apparently the guy who got arrested had caused problems with other homeless people too. I'm very glad I took that walk that night, which I wouldn't have done if the power hadn't gone out. If I hadn't, who knows if that first guy would even still be alive today. I had a really strange experience once when I was working at a Wendy's as a supervisor. This happened during a lunch rush on a weekend one day. I remember it pretty well because it was taking place on a very hot summer's day. So, we had air conditioning and our Wendy's was in a pretty poor area. This meant we were packed and selling a whole lot of cold drinks and Frosties on that day. I was running the floor, which meant I had to keep an eye on all aspects of food service and cashiering, so I had to be paying a lot of attention to a lot of things at once. I don't know if that means I was more or less likely to notice what I did. I noticed that these two teenage boys came into the restaurant. There was really nothing remarkable about them at all. I honestly can barely even remember what they even looked like, but what got me paying attention to them right away was the way they were acting. First off, they looked very, very nervous. But not only that, they were way too overdressed for how hot it was outside. They were both wearing jackets, and the heat index had to be about 100 degrees outside. When they came into the place, they didn't go to the bathroom or get in line right away. Instead, they started wandering around the dining room, looking very, very nervous. I kept an eye on them, watching them eventually get into the line, or serpentine as I remember it was called. But when they got about halfway through, they actually went under the railing and just left the store. I decided whatever they were up to, maybe they were just indecisive about what they were going to get. The lunch rush went on, and about 30 minutes after they left, I noticed they came back into the restaurant. They acted nearly identically to how they had before. I really didn't know what to think about these two. But something about the way they were behaving was really rubbing me the wrong way. I've always felt it's better to be safe than sorry. The police station was literally just across the street from the restaurant. The cops were always in there for food, and they always got it free too. So I had every reason to believe they wouldn't be mad at me if I called them over, and it ended up being for nothing. I left the front counter for about a minute, called over and explained to them what was going on. They actually told me it sounded like I was right to be concerned and they would be right over. I quickly went right back up to the front as quickly as possible to see how things were going to play out. Although they didn't use lights or sirens, 2 police cars showed up immediately and into the parking lot of the Wendy's. The first thing I noticed was the immediate panic from the 2 boys. They made a beeline straight over to the garbage cans and threw something away. Then, while the police were coming in one door, they tried to rush their way out of the opposite side of the store. Things got a little bit chaotic for a few moments there. Of course, all of the attention on everyone in the store switched over to the cops, and those two boys trying to get out. I guess one of the cops had seen the boys throwing that thing into the garbage, so one of them went to check out the garbage cans. They were also quickly able to get over to the boys and bring them back into the foyer. After going through those cans, the cops signaled for me to come over to the employee doorway. I did, but glanced back as I saw the other cops putting the two boys under arrest. I opened up the employee door and let the one cop in. What he showed me absolutely made me happy. I was suspicious. There were 2 handguns. Apparently, the two boys were planning an armed robbery of the store. I'm guessing they'd never done anything like that before, which would explain why they had seemed so nervous. It turned out they were just BB guns painted over, but it was still an attempted armed robbery, and I watched as the police handcuffed them and put them in their cars. I was glad I called. With how hot it's been in the US over the past few months, I thought I would tell a scary story of something that happened to me in the wintertime. Maybe it will help us all cool off a bit. So I used to be the manager of a fast food restaurant in northern Illinois. Even though the winters there can be pretty bad, they were much worse back then. This was actually my first job as the manager of a place. I had only been in the position for a couple of months as well. They had me in this really small store that normally didn't get a whole lot of business, so I was very often closing the store down at night and being the only manager there who was doing it. We were expecting the first really big snow of the season on this day. The first big snow in the area is always well anticipated, and the roads pretty much die after people go out and buy whatever they think they're going to need. The first big snow in the area is always anticipated. The roads pretty much die out after people go and buy whatever they think they're going to need for the next few days. So, we had a little bit of a busy rush during the afternoon, but by the time somewhere around 3:30 p.m., we were deader than a large graveyard. The snow began to fall heavily shortly after. Although it was light at first, it didn't take very long before it was a steady snowfall. As the sun went down, we really stopped getting any customers at all. I had to let some of my employees go home because we were simply not making any sales, and it was pointless to keep them there in the snow. It was almost as pointless as trying to keep the place open, but I didn't have any control over that really. I eventually took over doing the cash register and drive-thru myself, having one person making all of the food. The point being that there were only 2 of us left in the place. A few hours went by, and I was really looking forward to this night ending. I was also dreading the drive home that was awaiting me through all that snow. That was when these 2 young people came into the store. It was a girl and a guy. They both looked like they were around 18, if not even younger than that. While the boy went off to the bathroom or something, the girl came right up to the counter to talk to me. She was telling me that she and the guy had missed their bus and they were from out of state. They didn't have any money and were wondering if there was a homeless shelter or anywhere nearby they could stay for the night. I admitted that although I worked there, I didn't really live in the same town my store was in. I really had no idea if there was a shelter or not. I told them if they really needed to, though, I had no problem with them hanging out in the restaurant, at least until we closed. I'd also be happy to give them a little bit of free food if they wanted. We had to keep burgers on the grill and fries in the fry warmer the whole time anyway, and all that food would just go in the trash at the end of the night, because we weren't getting anyone coming into the place. I told them I hoped I could help them out just a little bit. Well, they were very thankful for the help, although I felt bad I couldn't do more for them. I mean, I had been homeless in a city myself that I was unfamiliar with before in my life. I knew how scary it could be. I almost even considered offering them to come back to my apartment with me so they wouldn't have to fight against the elements. I mean, I knew that if there was a homeless shelter in the town, they would not still be accepting people into the shelter with all this snow. While they were eating, my other employee went out to talk to them a bit. I just sort of kept things going and tried to decide what I might have wanted to do. Part of me really felt that since few people showed me much kindness when I was in their position, it would be nice to show them a lot of it. I mean, having to be outside all night in a snow shower like we were having would have been horrible. It might even have killed them. And before I had a chance to make up my mind about anything, though, I heard my employee come back into the employee area. He told me he had called up a friend of his who he lived with. It was actually a guy who had worked at the restaurant before, too, and they decided they were going to let the two people sleep over at their place. Well, I was a bit relieved, but I also felt bad for being so relieved. It was like I was feeling good that I didn't really have to help. He also went to grab a clean rag and wetted it down as he told me this. I asked him what it was for. He told me the guy had a really nasty cut on the palm of his hand. He figured he had slipped and hit it on something during the snowstorm. When the store closed, I let the employee leave while I did all of the closing up myself. It was actually kind of nice being in the store all alone with all that snow falling outside. After I had just about everything done, I went to go to the restroom before it was time to drive home. It was going to be a long drive in this weather. When I went inside, I noticed the mirror and stall door were covered with blood. It was like someone had taken the bleeding palm of his hand and just splattered the blood all over the place. It was fresh enough, too, that it couldn't have been anyone but the guy who had just gone home with one of my employees. Disturbed, I went over to the office and looked up his contact information on his application. Although he did have a phone number on it, when I tried to call, the number had been disconnected. There was also an address listed, but I had no idea where it was. We didn't have an internet connection at the store, and this was ages before Wi-Fi and smartphones. So I had no idea how to find it, but I was deeply worried. The only thing I could do was call the police, and it took them forever to get over there. I showed them the bathroom and explained what happened and gave them the address. Then, after they left, I just spent the time being worried. I was dying to find out what had happened. I was so worried that something would happen to my employee. I didn't find out until the next day when he showed up at work. Apparently, I didn't have anything to worry about, because they never even got to my employee's house. Apparently, the guy and girl had started acting very, very bizarre and shady in the car. They even asked my employee if he wanted to try any PCP. He immediately kicked them both out. I felt great that he had offered to take them in instead of me. I have to admit I can be a bit mild-mannered, and I might not have been as brave as to kick them out. I'm just happy he was okay in the end. Trigger warning, heavy cursing. It's still an angering story. The lesson I took from this whole thing was to always read through your lease and rental agreement fully before signing. This story takes place 4 years ago in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm originally from California, so trading up city life for a less urban life was very challenging for me. Making friends was hard, but I made the move to be with my dad who lived in an apartment complex with a roommate. My dad was a trucker, so he was gone for weeks at a time, while I was left all alone to work and come home to a foreign place that I was very slowly becoming accustomed to. My roommate was also gone most of the time because he had a girlfriend. He would at least leave his dog with me though, so I never truly felt alone. I also had an old lady for a neighbor that would come and check up on me too. That's just kinda how people were in that area. I honestly found it kind of nice how many people knew their neighbors. I got to know everyone in my building's name after about 6 months of living there, all except for one. There was a man, I'd say in his early to mid-50s, who lived directly below my apartment. He looked, for lack of a better description, just like a creep. He was balding except for the sides of his head, which had hair that was very straggly too. He was tall and kinda skinny. He had these outdated 90s glasses, the kind you'd see on America's Most Wanted. He also had a really thick creeper mustache. He was the only person in the entire building who wasn't friendly, or at least didn't make an effort to say hello or even introduce himself to me. He also happened to be the maintenance man for all 5 buildings. I didn't really think too much of this at first. Honestly, I don't really care if you're not overtly friendly to me. I enjoy having space of my own, and sometimes being too friendly can get a bit suspicious. That's just a personal problem, but I'm explaining why this didn't set up any red flags at first. One day, when I was pulling out of the driveway to go to work in the morning, I noticed across the large lawn that led to the door to our buildings, the maintenance man was standing in the center, staring directly at me. Maybe stare is the wrong word. It was more like a glare, very intense and focused. At first, I looked around confused, thinking that perhaps he was looking at someone or something behind me. I was the only one there, though. Although a bit creeped out, I shrugged it off and continued on with my day, forgetting all about it pretty much. The next day, I was over at my neighbor Claire's apartment, the nice older lady. She happened to bring up a maintenance issue that she had, but mentioned she would never ask the maintenance man for anything, and neither should I. I tried to ask her more about what she meant by that, but she ended up being very broad instead. She just said something along the lines of, "He's just a well-known creep around here." Fast forward to the first incident. It was around 2 a.m. and I was still awake, but only just barely, sitting on the couch watching Parks and Rec alone in the apartment. I was just starting to drift off into sleep when I heard a soft noise near the front door. Thankfully, the show was very low in volume, because normally I wouldn't pick up on such a quiet noise most of the time. I turned off the TV and began listening intently. Next to the living room on the right side is the patio area, and on the left is the kitchen and the front door. The light from the moon and outside lamps were flooding through the patio glass door. I could see the doorknob to the front door moving. Not just moving, but someone was using a key. In an instant, the door flung open and I was on my feet, with nowhere to hide at that point. I stood my ground and saw the silhouette step into the kitchen. That's when I saw it was the maintenance man. My stomach dropped and he stopped dead in his tracks when he spotted me, looking as if it was unexpected to find me awake. I noticed he also had a large coat on, even though it wasn't winter or even that cold on that particular night. I noticed that only because the jacket looked bulky, as if you were carrying things in it that I couldn't see. "What the fuck are you doing?" was all I managed to squeak out. I was shaking, my knees feeling like they were going to give out. For reference, I was a 22-year-old woman, standing at a whopping 5'4", with no way to defend myself at all from where I was standing. The man looked shocked, which made me feel as if I had gained a little bit of power in the situation. He retorted, confused and angrily, "Your toilet is making a loud noise I could hear from my bedroom." I was angry and terrified, and only reacted with more anger when I saw him scrambling for excuses. "So you just let yourself into my apartment at 2 in the morning? I'm reporting this to management first thing." He stepped closer to me. I backed up a few steps but still stood my ground, quickly turning on the light closest to me so he could see my fury. "The toilet is rumbling. I need to check it now." Now I was trembling so hard I could barely stand. I had adrenaline and anger and fear all coursing heavily through my body. "Get the fuck out!" He started to take the liberty to look around the kitchen where he was standing. My head immediately thought, shit, what if he goes for a knife? And that's when he said it. "You know, I can come in whenever I want." The sentence makes me shiver to this day. I didn't know what to do, and felt the power over the situation quickly dwindling down to a bad feeling that something horrible was going to happen. "If you don't get the fuck out of my apartment right now, I'm gonna start screaming as loud as I can." My voice was cracking and shaky, which made my heart drop to my stomach. I immediately felt like I was going to be sick when he took yet another step towards me. "Check the lease. I can come in whenever I want. See you later." He winked at me, creating a wave of nausea, and I felt faint. He slowly turned around and walked out, closing the door behind him, even going so far as to lock it from the outside with his extra key. The next day, I contacted management as soon as their office opened. I could tell the conversation wasn't going anywhere, though, when the manager sounded irritated right off the bat. When I told her that the guy had entered my apartment illegally, she cut me off and told me they do not allow any illegal activity, and took what I was saying very seriously. I thought to myself, yes, I've got him, until the manager said this: "You can't just throw around accusations without proof. This man has dedicated over 20 years to working for this company, and we don't plan on getting rid of him anytime soon. Perhaps if you'd read over your lease like you should have," yes, she was actually scolding me, "you would have seen the clause that states a maintenance worker has keys to the entire property, and if there's a maintenance issue, they're permitted access to the property at any time of day." This floored me. It couldn't possibly be legal. Of course, I'm from California, and of course, I didn't read the lease carefully. When I moved there, my dad was already living in the apartment, and I had literally nowhere else to go. So if I were to be living there, I was going to have to sign it no matter what, and that's what I did. Needless to say, nothing got done about the issue. Fast forward again. A few days go by, and I don't see Mr. Maintenance Freak at all. Until I do. This time, I'm pulling in after a long 10-hour shift at work. I hadn't forgotten about the scary incident, but I had put it at the back of my mind for the time being to concentrate on other things, although I lost a bit of sleep over it. I parked my car facing the large lawn area again, and started using my phone for a few minutes. I'm peering down at my phone when I glance up for a split second and see him standing there. He's standing across the lawn staring angrily at me, and I mean absolutely furious. I quickly looked back down and pretended to have not seen him, getting that sinking feeling again. As a paranoid person, I put the key in the ignition just in case, and pretended to keep scrolling on my phone while subtly locking my door. I glanced up again, and this time he's stalking toward me very fast. I look in my rearview mirror hoping to see someone else that he may be stomping angrily toward. Of course, no one else was there. It's nearly dark now, but when he gets about 10 to 15 feet away from the front of my car, I can hear him shouting something. I couldn't make out what he was saying, though. I put my phone down and am watching him come right at me until he reaches my window and starts banging on it with all his might. He slams his body into the door. He's also fidgeting angrily with the handle even though the doors are locked. My car doesn't have automatic locks, so I'm praying to God that I remember to lock them all at this point. My hands are shaking so bad I'm having trouble even starting it. When I do, I realized what he was saying, which was a repeated loop of the following phrases. "I'm going to get you, bitch. I told you I can come in whenever I want. You really want to take me on? I'll kill you." I peeled out of there so fast I didn't even know where I was going. I drove to the next county over, found a motel, and stayed the night there. The next day I took work off and went straight to the management's office. I told them exactly what he'd said, but no matter what I told them, they would not believe me. This maintenance man was apparently God's gift to mankind or something. He was a monument to the company, and they appreciated his 20 years of service and dedication to them over him risking someone's life with threats. Long story short, I lost it. I called her a psychotic cunt and ended up getting evicted. I reported all of this to the police, but between the lack of evidence I had and his perfect record and shining references from his employers that seemed to love him, the police said there was nothing they could do to move forward at that point. My dad and I ended up finding a nice home about 10 minutes away from that place. I ended up inviting Claire, my older neighbor, to the new house a few months later. She told me there was a single woman in the apartment before the roommate and my dad had moved in there, that also left in a hurry after something happened with the maintenance man, something about taking photos of her walking to and from her apartment to her car. When she had confronted him about it, he had told her, "I can do whatever I want." I guess in Kansas City, maintenance workers are like God or something. They get away with whatever they want and have shining reputations. Needless to say, it's been 4 years, and I moved back to California. Okay, let's start from the beginning, shall we? I work in the leasing office at a property in Texas. I also live on site. We have about 400 apartments and take up 2 sides of a street. I live across the street in the very back, and I try to keep that to myself as much as possible. I do not like for residents to know that I live there. About 2 months in, a woman and her 2 grown sons lease an apartment with us. The sons are twins. One is special needs, and the other is, well, different. He had a very active imagination and was very focused on sex. Almost immediately after they moved in, things started getting very weird. The first encounter. One day, I was crossing the street after work to go home. As soon as I reached the other sidewalk, I hear a voice calling out to me. "Hey yo, Raquel!" I turned towards the voice, which I realized was coming from the bus stop at the end of the street. I couldn't recognize who it was until I got a bit closer. Who the fuck is that? I think to myself. We meet face to face, and I realize who it is from when he moved in. I knew he was a little bit weird, so I was trying to keep my distance while still being polite. He was really easy to piss off, and I didn't know what he was capable of. I didn't want to make him think there was anything else behind that polite hello. He starts telling me that I look just like his baby mama who lives in North Texas. He then jumps to a different subject about how he had just ran all the way from downtown to here, then decides to tell me his entire family history, naming all his cousins and homeboys, rambling on and on about essentially nothing. The entire time, I hadn't said a single word other than the standard, "Oh, uh-huh, okay." I kept taking steps backward to indicate that I was trying to leave, but he kept talking and moving closer and closer toward me. As I was trying to go, I noticed he had this huge boner. He was wearing basketball shorts as always, so it was pretty difficult to hide. This creeped me out, but somehow I managed to get away from him. He sat at the bus stop staring at me as I walked away. I didn't want him to know that I lived there, so I just kept walking down the street to make it look like I lived somewhere else. Every now and then I would see him around the property, or he would come to the office and talk to me. It was always very uncomfortable. The leasing office had a hallway leading to the manager's office, the copier, and the package room. There was a door on it too, which came in handy quite a bit. His visits got to the point where every time I saw him walking up to the office, I would run and hide in this back room and let the other staff deal with him. He wasn't ever creepy towards them, and they knew the situation, so they were cool with it. Cut to December. Our office was being remodeled, so we were using our business center as a temporary workspace. It's only one room, and there's only one way in or out and no place to hide. I was alone in that office one day, and who should come walking in but my worst nightmare. He needed to borrow our copy of his mail key because he'd misplaced his or didn't have one or whatever. We have to take an ID in order to release keys, and he didn't have his, so he had to go to his apartment, get the ID, and come back. In the time that he was gone, I set my phone on my coworker's desk and started recording video in case any crazy shit happened, so I would at least have evidence. He noticed the tattoo on my shoulder and commented on it, asking, "Is that your name?" or "Why the hell would I have my own name tattooed on myself?" I told him it was my grandmother's name, which sends him into this whole spiel about how he has his grandmother tattooed on him. He's an artist and draws people's faces. He leaves to go check his mail, then returns a few minutes later. However, when he returns, he's added something to his ensemble. He now has a pencil behind his ear, I suppose to make him look like more of an artist. He then said he was going to draw my face, but I had to send him a picture so he could look at an image of me. He said he would draw me and bring the picture to the office later that week. Note, I did not send him a picture. Months go by, no picture. I was walking through the pool to go walk to an apartment. He catches me in the pool area. Fuck, no escape. He presents me with, well, I don't really know what to call it. It's me, or I guess how he sees me. The picture was drawn on lined notebook paper in pen, and looked like he threw it together in 3 minutes. He drew me black, I'm white, wearing a short, tight dress, not something I would ever wear. Legs 2 different sizes, carrying a purse with a Texas on it. It was very creepy. I kept it on my fridge to remind myself I was never safe with him around. Upon further inspection of this drawing on my fridge, I noticed as well that he'd drawn nipples on it under the dress. The next day I talked to the maintenance man about it. He said he did originally draw it naked, but decided to put clothes on it because giving it to me like that would be too forward. What the fuck was wrong with this guy? Another day, I was walking out of one of the pool gates and he was walking in through another. I saw him out of my peripheral but didn't acknowledge him because, well, I'm sure you get it by now. "Hey yo, Raquel," he says in a very low voice. I'm hard of hearing, so I can get away with pretending I didn't hear someone sometimes. This made him very angry. The reason I know this is because he talks to one of our maintenance staff about me regularly. That person always relays the creepy, weird, delusional shit he says about me. According to him, I was very rude, and he don't play like that where he's from. The next few times I saw him, he had this deranged look in his eyes like he was disgusted by the sight of me. It honestly kinda looked like he wanted to hurt me. A few weeks go by and he apparently gets over being mad and resumes being the creepiest motherfucker alive. The maintenance man tells me he claimed to have met my boyfriend and that he's a cool dude so he's gonna back off. I asked my boyfriend if he had ever met him, and he said no. The maintenance man told me that he claimed to have met my parents when they stopped in for a visit too. I asked my parents if they spoke to or saw anyone while visiting me at work. They also said no. I don't know when or how he could even have met them or even saw them. I never saw him around when they were there. I confirmed from multiple different people that were there that he was nowhere around. I got the distinct feeling he might have been hiding in the bushes or something. Recently, I decided to use our fitness center late at night. The fitness center has big windows that overlook the second pool on my side of the property. While I'm on the treadmill, which is in front of one of these windows, he just appears, staring at me through the glass, waving at me, watching me. I pretend there's a glare in the window and I didn't see him. He disappears completely into the dark shadows in the pool area, and I continue my workout. The next day, the maintenance man tells me he talked to our friend, and he couldn't stop talking about how he'd seen me there. He went into detail about what I was wearing, how form-fitting it was, how sweaty I was, all creepy shit that gave me the chills. I avoided the fitness center after that, and used my real gym to avoid seeing him again. A few days go by, and my informant, the lovely maintenance man, you get it, tells me that my stalker was wondering why I suddenly stopped going to the gym. Apparently, ever since that fateful night, he'd been returning every day to the pool around the same time to wait for me, so he could watch me work out again. Nope. He started showing up at the office more frequently too, and I had to avoid him. Friday, he was sitting in the pool area by the office directly behind where my desk was. There was a huge window behind me. I turned to get something out of my cabinet, only to see him staring at me through the glass. He waved, I flashed a nervous peace sign and proceeded with my business. He was not in swimwear, but rather fully dressed. He had his notebook with him, and was frantically drawing something. Great, here comes another picture of me, but this time in workout clothes or something. My coworker went to put up the golf cart and close the cabana. She has to go through the pool area to do this, so she got a glimpse of what he was drawing. A cross with my name down the middle. According to him, I had asked him to draw a tattoo for me, so that's what he was doing, drawing a tattoo for me that had my own name on it. It's bad enough that it was a cross, but with my name, that would burn my flesh. He says he's going to give it to me the next day. The next day, he didn't show up. I'm not sure when I'd ever asked him to draw anything for me, but I'm pretty sure the time was fucking never. 2 weeks passed, and I thought maybe he had finally given up. Enough time had passed for him to do so, and maybe I could use the fitness center once again. My friend and I went around 8 p.m., and we didn't see any signs of him, so we went ahead with our workout. I was flipping over to do leg raises on my right side, which caused me to face the door. Chills engulfed my entire existence, and my heart stopped for a second. He was standing across the street on the phone. I started to panic and find a place to hide from view. Peeking around the corner, I see him turn and walk through the outside hallway behind the leasing office, his normal route to his apartment. Hoping he wouldn't come back for a while, we decided to continue. I kept glancing out the windows every few seconds to make sure he hadn't reappeared, but he did. Still talking on his phone, but this time he starts pacing around the fitness center very slowly. looking through the windows with this creepy-ass side glance like I wouldn't be able to see him there creeping. I keep trying to hide from view, and I'm waiting for an opportunity to get the fuck out of there. I'm hiding in a corner when he walks up to the locked door and knocks on it. He continues to knock for a solid 3 minutes, then finally leaves. He walks down the street a little way, and I take the chance to run the fuck back to my apartment as fast as I can. Today, my informant told me that the stalker said I wouldn't let him into the fitness center for a drink of water. He said he had just run all the way from insert popular place nearby and just wanted some water, but I refused to let him in. He then switched up his story and said he was trying to give me the drawing of the tattoo I had asked him for. 1. He didn't run from anywhere. He was wearing flip-flops. 2. He had been standing still for a good 30 minutes before coming up to the center. He had gone back to his fucking apartment, for Christ's sake, where there is water. So why the fuck would he go all the way to the fitness center for a glass of water? 3. He didn't have any drawing with him. He didn't have any pockets on what he was wearing either, and it wasn't in his hands. He then started talking to my neighbors that live across from me, and started telling them I was a weird, crazy girl and they should stay away from me. That shook me to my core, because if that's true, then he somehow found out where I lived. I knocked on my neighbor's door and asked him about it. He said he had no idea what I was talking about. Luckily, this Friday is my last day at this property, as I'm transferring to a new one closer to where I want to live. I'll still have to live here for 2 more months, and I can't wait to leave. Trigger warning. Themes of sexual assault. So I live in the PNW, which has a great number of excellent campsites. A favorite of mine isn't actually a designated campsite, but a forest road right on a river. Being a moody young woman, I would frequently make sojourns in my dumpy Toyota Camry to this one spot, so I could be alone on the river and meditate on whatever was bothering me. Camping alone as a 20-something female often inspired anxiety in both myself and my folks, but I wouldn't let that deter me. Camping alone was something I genuinely enjoyed doing, and after experiencing a series of emotional misfortunes, I needed some time to myself. The last time I ever went to this particular spot, I must have been around 21 years old. I had just had a closure conversation with someone who broke my heart some months prior, and wanted to take some time to process that. Luckily enough, I had gotten consecutive days off work from my retail job, so I packed up my car and made the 3-hour drive to the spot. The spot is fairly well known, and often a few other campers would be there on the weekends, but during the week it was more likely to be empty. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. I was slightly disappointed to discover a turquoise Chevrolet truck and another silver car parked closest to the river. I parked some distance behind them and began to unload my things. 2 young gentlemen were hanging out by the truck, and as I passed by, they greeted me. I muttered a hello and kept on walking. I picked a spot I thought was nice and went back to get the rest of my things. As I was passing their cars again, one of the men, the shorter, stockier one, rushed to a boulder near the path where some pistols were sitting and quickly concealed them. "Oh, sorry about that. I didn't mean to scare you." There was something childlike in his manner, like he did this specifically so I would pay attention to him. I told him it was fine. It didn't bother me at all, and kept walking. I unloaded the rest of my things, set up my camp, and got a fire going. I was kind of tired after the long day of driving and hauling my stuff around, so I plopped down in a camp chair and got some chili mac cooking for dinner. It was a beautiful evening. Not too hot, and golden hour on the river was always a fantastic sight, so I was thoroughly enjoying the moment. I could see the 2 men swimming upriver a bit, but it was easy enough to ignore them. By the time I finished eating, they passed by my camp on the opposite bank and were walking into the woods. I went down to the bank to get water for my dishes when I heard the stockier one call out to me suddenly. Hey, I just wanted to let you know I'm a good guy, okay?" Maybe this should have alarmed me more, but at the time it didn't. I definitely thought the guy was socially inept, but I left my judgments at that. I just elected to answer with a polite, "okay." I wanted him to leave me alone, and thought if I was nice but uninterested, he'd take the hint. It was a demonstrably ineffective approach. Some time had passed by, and I had been musing over the last week's events and just generally enjoying the beauty around me when he came limping up to my camp. He feigned a grunt as if he was in pain. I don't exactly remember the exchange we had, but he wound up sitting at my camp and explaining to me that he had some injuries in the past that were adversely impacted by the cold of the river. Now, before I go any further, I'll preface this by saying I was a pretty passive person when I was younger, especially with strangers. I've definitely had to practice setting and maintaining boundaries as I've gotten older, and this instance demonstrates the danger of failing to do so. I kick myself every time I tell this story. I'm not sure if immediately telling the guy to piss off would have made him leave me alone, being a young, pretty girl alone in the woods, but I regret not speaking my mind more clearly that day. All that said, given some previous experiences, I had taken on a policy of engaging in active listening with others who seemed to be struggling. I obviously was faced with my own woes and wanted to be treated compassionately myself, so I aimed to always do the same with others. It was clear this guy was having some issues, and by all exterior judgments, he seemed like he was down on his luck, maybe even with some maladaptive tendencies. He continued to stay at my camp and began telling me all about his life. These stories were all pretty fantastical, the kind of lies a child would tell you of some incredible adventure or grandeur. They went on and got weirder and weirder. He explained that the aforementioned injuries that were paining him were the result of falling a great distance while on a welding job, where his hand was caught by being impaled by a piece of rebar. He described his heroic effort of self-preservation by unhooking himself and falling the rest of the distance, breaking his legs or something like that. I just gave him a series of, wow, that must have been very painful. He also revealed he was apparently recently homeless after splitting up with his girlfriend, who had been talking to another guy. That's why he was staying here in his truck, the aforementioned Chevy. He also told me he DJ'd at a joint in the closest town, and made a lot of money doing it. He further increased his exaggerations by telling me he was also a 5-star chef, and enlightened me on a gross-sounding dish of his own creation that was essentially a soup made from watered-down fruit jelly and other sweet things. Told me he was a Navy SEAL specializing in small arms. It was then he revealed to me that the pistols he thought had scared me before were just air pistols. He augmented his tale of being in special forces by doing some twirls with one of them, and showing me what ultimately turned out to be mediocre marksmanship. At a later point, he even wound up giving me one of them, saying it made him think of doing bad things. I hesitantly accepted it. I was pretty sketched out by this point and wanted this dude to leave, but I lacked the backbone to tell him to go away. Unfortunately, as the evening wore on, he just continued to get weirder and weirder. By this point, he had begun bringing his belongings from his truck and setting them up around my camp. This was a process that happened gradually, each new conversation note eliciting a new show-and-tell idea. I can't remember all that he brought down, but it included his guitar and a lot of other stuff. He even tried to give me some of it, but after the air pistol, I declined. The conversation dragged on, eventually with him telling me in detail about childhood traumas as well. His father, who had been in the military, was very strict and often beat him. He also told me about his cousin who had sexually abused him severe enough to leave scars in certain areas, which he described to me in detail. He then got real close to me when he told me this, looking square in the eye, unblinking. "And that's why I'd never hurt you," he said, still staring at me. I shit you not, my skin started to crawl. I had a few things to defend myself with, a hunting knife and some bear spray, but he hadn't done anything directly threatening yet. Not long after this, his ex-girlfriend showed up. He introduced me as his friend, and they talked a bit before he kind of ignored her in favor of me. The whole thing made me even more uncomfortable. She didn't stay long and sped away in her truck. I'm assuming in some fit of jealousy. What did I do to deserve that? I didn't say anything other than that I was going to bed, hoping he'd take the hint and just leave. He said he needed some alone time to himself, and I thought I had lucked out. I went into my tent to bed down for the night, as it had gotten quite dark, only to discover a cheap ring had been left on my pillow. He must have placed it there when I stepped away to go to the bathroom or something. Furthermore, I could hear him wandering around my campsite. I peeked out of my tent. He had his head in his hands as he paced back and forth, muttering to himself. A powerful feeling of needing to flee immediately came over me. There was no way I could stay here. Even if he didn't do anything to hurt me, at minimum he would annoy me the whole 3 days I planned to stay. I immediately started to pack my stuff. When he asked what I was doing, I told him I was just going to go. Since I was car camping, I had a bit of stuff with me that would require a few trips. I hurried to get it all in my car. On one trip up the path to the parking area, he stood in the middle of the path, complaining my flashlight was blinding him. I didn't say anything and stepped around him. Most of my trips after that were unbothered, though I went with one arm free so I could carry my hunting knife and be ready in case he tried to get physical with me. On my second to last trip down, he came out of the dark from the direction of his truck. He was sobbing. I didn't do anything wrong. I flat out ignored him and ventured down the path once more to grab what I could and hightail it to my car. I wound up leaving a cord of wood behind, not seeing it worth the danger to go back for it. I shut all my doors and hopped in, absolutely elated at the sound of my 30-year-old car starting right up. I got the hell out of there and drove the 3 hours back to my house. I didn't have reception until about halfway through the drive, during which point I called my mom and told her what happened. She was upset I didn't tell her where I was going. I told my dad and stepmom, who I lived with at the time, and that she was glad I was okay. When I got back, my stepmother asked what I was doing back so early. I explained what happened all over again. My dad later suggested I get a gun if I wanted to continue solo camping, in case something like that ever happened again. The next day, I went out to my car so I could drive to meet some friends, and found my tire had mysteriously gone flat. What an immense stroke of luck it didn't happen at the campsite, or somewhere else in the mountains where I didn't have reception. I'm in my mid-20s now, and moved to the city about 6 months ago. My roommate and best friend discovered that air pistol while he was helping me move. He knew I didn't own any guns, and was immediately confused thinking it was real. When he asked me about it, I laughed and explained everything that happened. I haven't been back to that site since, and while I'd definitely bring a friend there, I probably won't go alone ever again. This happened a few months ago in the beginning of summer. I've held off on sharing it for so long because I didn't want to be judged for my actions. I joined this stupid online dating app since I divorced last winter. Just kind of living it up, you know? I somehow matched with this man who lived in New York, an 8-hour drive from me. After texting for a few weeks, he sprung it on me that he was going to drive to see me. Since I'm staying with family since my divorce, I decided we'd get a hotel. He told me he'd find one and pay for it. I already felt super bad he was driving so far, so I was trying to find deals in the cheapest place that wasn't sketchy as fuck. I lived about 45 minutes outside of the city in the state that I live in. I'm not super familiar with some areas, so the hotel I booked ended up being no bueno, but I didn't know this until I got there. It was dark by the time I had arrived after getting lost 4 different times. There was a very shady motel right across the street with 2 men smoking cigarettes on the porch, lots of truckers and travelers traveling through. I just walked into that hotel like, shit, I just fucked up. But I went with it anyway, because I really didn't have a choice. And NY, what we'll refer to him as, was only an hour away, so he'd be there very soon. The hotel was run by Jamaicans, I think a family, but this comes into play later, which is why I mention it. The woman who checked me in was nice, but the entire place just gave off these weird vibes. The lighting, the smell of bleach, the carpet, I don't really know. It was really bright, but also really heavy and dark, if that makes sense. I started shaking as I was trying to check in. The reservation was under NY's name. At first, she told me she couldn't find it. His last name was Spanish, so I thought maybe I was pronouncing it wrong, even though I'm pretty good with Spanish. This made it awkward, because now she knew I was meeting a stranger. I thought maybe he gave you the wrong name, she said. I nervously chuckled. She put me on the second floor. I was expecting an elevator, but as I turned, I saw that behind me was a huge carpeted staircase. This threw me off too. I don't really know why. I get to my room and just pace around, waiting for this stranger from the internet to finally show up. It starts raining. I'm sitting by the window sipping a glass of wine when I see a pickup truck pull in. Maybe it's him. A man in a black hoodie gets out and locks his truck and runs inside. I start panicking, thinking it's him. He had no bags or luggage because he was going to come kidnap me or something. There was a loud knock on my door. I jumped so hard I immediately stood up. I made my way over to the door and looked through the peephole. This was NY. No black hoodie, carrying lots of bags with him, so I crack the door open and smile. He comes in and I share my terrifying thoughts with him and we chuckle. Sex happens. Later that night we fall asleep. He's spooning me but also has his arms all the way around me with his head on top of mine. It was a weird position. I was woken from a dead sleep, just so sweaty because he was holding me so tightly. I thought that's what had woken me up. But then I heard it. Someone was fucking with our door. I heard the handle start moving as whoever it was tried to open it, but it wouldn't open so easily. NY jumped out of bed so fast I wondered how long he'd been awake listening to this to react so quickly. I pulled the covers up to my chin as he was standing in the dark in his undies looking at the door. He looked through the peephole and said he thought it was one of the Jamaican men who worked there. We had a chain on the door as well as all the locks, so he kept the chain on as he opened it just a few inches. Before he could even ask what the man wanted, he just said this, "Is the white girl in there?" I remember getting chills all over my body immediately. NY said no and slammed the door, almost completely unbothered by this. The man said something about needing a credit card from me. NY yells back that the room is on his card under his name and he'll take care of everything in the morning. I looked at the clock and it was like 2 fucking a.m. I turn over and just stare at the wall hoping I can fall back to sleep. NY wrapped his arms around me again and is immediately snoring in my ear. Good thing he was hot, I guess. The next morning we decide to get breakfast. It's super early and we're both feeling groggy. I'm hoping as we round the corner to the stairs that no one is at the front desk, because they definitely heard the noises from our room this morning, and I was feeling really embarrassed. Thankfully, the front desk was indeed empty. Then I saw him though, an older black male standing a few feet from the exit. I honestly don't know if he was really Jamaican. I don't know if he was actually a part of the family who owned this place even, or a guest, or just someone else. I don't know. But his face was sunken in, and he had this weird chilling look in his eyes as he glared right at me. I knew immediately upon seeing him this was the same guy from last night. NY whispers for me to just keep walking, so I break eye contact with this guy and lean into NY as we make our way to the exit. As we pass by, the man is silent. As I'm pushing open the door to exit the building, he starts saying, "There's the white girl. I found the white girl. She makes a lot of noise." I was terrified. I left for work after breakfast. I was gone a few hours and returned to the hotel to find the room empty. I texted NY and asked where he was. He texted back saying he was in the laundry room and he'd be right back up. I sat down on the bed waiting for him. I heard some footsteps outside the door, the floor creaking like someone was standing there shifting their weight or something. I figured maybe NY had forgotten his room key, so I got up to look through the damn peephole, but it was not him. The creepy man was standing outside the door just staring into the peephole. I jumped back and started crying. I called NY and yelled for him to come to the room quickly because that man was outside the door. He was long gone by the time NY got there. He went down to the front desk and spoke to the woman about this man, but she just kept saying she had no idea who he was talking about and she would keep an eye out for whoever this was. That night I couldn't sleep. I just felt I could feel him lingering around outside the door, but I was too scared to actually look. NY was sleeping at this point. I rolled over and decided to be the big spoon and wrap my arms around him. He was basically still a stranger, but this was the most comforting thing I had at the moment. We checked out the next morning. I grabbed his hand as we made our way down the stairs, because guess who was standing right there? Yep. The woman from the front desk was now gone, replaced by a younger male. The creepy man was standing there smiling as we neared the bottom of the stairs, just this awful bone-chilling grin. "You're a lucky man with a white girl like that," was the last comment we heard from this creep. NY spun around and told him to fuck off, then walked me to my car. He waited while I drove off to make sure no one followed me. I don't know, maybe there's more we could have done. But again, the man never did anything physical or anything. It was just a really unnerving experience. About a month later, I was telling my dad about it. He laughed and told me I had picked the worst part of the city, and he thought he had heard about this place being shut down multiple times for drugs or sex trafficking. I can't remember. It would always go under new ownership. So I had known this woman since before I could even remember. She was really good friends with my mom and dad through high school, so I already knew her before all of this. Unfortunately, my mother was an alcoholic and pill addict, which led to pretty bad neglect for several years when I was very young. A story for another day, perhaps. After missing most of my third grade year, DCS got involved, and my dad got custody of me. He was dating my stepmother at the time, and at first everything was fairly normal. She was like an older sister to me, like a good friend. It wasn't too long though before I noticed things start to change. One day, when I was about 9, I was sitting in the living room floor playing with my back against the couch. My stepmother crossed the living room to go down the hallway, and as she did, seemed to shoulder check the doorway. As soon as she did this, she turned around and started yelling at me, accusing me of pushing her. I stared at her dumbfounded, because I hadn't ever moved from my spot on the floor. She continued yelling and accusing me as I tried to rationalize everything in my head. Maybe I'd gotten up and didn't remember, but why would I push her? I had no negative feelings toward her at this point, so it really didn't make any sense. But she was an adult, and I was a child. Surely, she must know what she was talking about. Stepmother was a taller, skinny woman with long golden blonde hair, straightened through the length with those poofy 80s bangs on top. She typically wore high-waisted jeans and kept long, pristine red nails that would end up being a horrifying symbol to me in my teen years. Things only got worse as I got older. I would speak to my mom on occasion over the phone, or in letter over the first few years. But each time I did, stepmother would become more and more hostile toward me, claiming my contact with my mother was making me misbehave. But I was always an introvert. I loved reading and school. I was a bit of a nerd and hated getting into trouble, so this accusation really didn't sit right with me even then. But what could I do about it? I was just a kid. Before too long, I noticed that stepmother looked for any opportunity alone with me, to treat me however she wanted. She quickly became extremely militant. Each morning, she woke me up for school by bursting into my room and aggressively jerking the covers from my body. Some mornings even grabbing my feet and digging her nails in, twisting my toes. I was expected to follow a strict schedule on school mornings. 6:15, get out of bed. 6:15 to 6:25 a.m., get dressed for school. 6:25, have breakfast. At this time, I was expected to stand in the exact center point of the threshold between the kitchen and the dining room, ready to take my breakfast and sit in my spot at the table. 6:35, I was to be done. 6:45, finish getting ready for school. And at that point, be sitting Indian style in the center of the living room, waiting on everyone to be ready. If I did not follow this schedule down to the exact minute, punishment would be doled out severely. She would grab my hands on taking my breakfast, twisting one or two fingers out of the socket, pulling me close to grit through her teeth at me with glaring, hateful eyes. Sometimes she would step in, including my feet, grinding her heels into my bare skin, twisting and glaring hate into me. On a few occasions, she even broke my wood hairbrushes across my face, leaving busted blood vessels and massive bruises. When the damage was too obvious, she would try to hide me away for a day or so, gently waking me the next morning, acting as though I was just sick, and telling me I was too ill to go to school, brushing my hair back gently and telling me to just go back to sleep. This treatment rolled over into my days after school too, and would evolve into other aggressive behaviors. She made sure to conceal any sign of mistreatment from my father, but some still happened right underneath his nose. At the dinner table, she would dig her toes into my leg and scrape so hard she would shave off chunks of skin from my shins with her toenails. Even at church, placing what looked like an affectionate hand on my back, but would proceed to give me an extremely painful and deep pinch on my back, leaving huge bruises in their place that no one would ever see. I was given an hour and a half after school each day to do my homework. After that, I was expected to go to our playroom, where I was to entertain her daughter. Her daughter was between 5 and 7 when things started to get really bad. I was expected to play what she wanted, when she wanted, and abide by any request she made. This was never said explicitly, but understood and later learned the hard way. One day during the summer, while eating lunch with her daughter in the playroom, she asked me to open her dessert. She had this kid cuisine that she had merely taken all but 2 bites of. Stepmother would typically leave the plastic on her dessert as a system to encourage her to eat her dinner first. Of course, when she asked me to open it, I asked her if she was done eating her meal, passively addressing the fact she had barely touched it. I was about 14 at the time, and it seemed like a plausible thing to big sister her about. But when I didn't give her exactly what she wanted, she got up in a huff to go tattle to her mother, as most 6-year-olds tend to do. While the stepmother was immediately enraged and barreled down the hallway in my direction. I don't even think I was out of view of her daughter when she grabbed me by the hair and started dragging me away. I tried to keep up but lost my balance and fell to the floor as she continued to drag me down the hallway by my hair. Once we reached my bedroom, she started kicking me in the stomach, then pulled me to my feet to face the bed. She then began rummaging through my belt drawer and pulled out my woven leather belt she had already used more than once, then proceeded to beat me with it, starting at my shoulder blades all the way down to my ankles. Heaven forbid if I screamed, she would just beat me even more. The abuse also did not stop with the physical, as she seemed to get a real kick out of bullying me. This she wasn't so worried about hiding from my father. She would make it seem so light-hearted and jovial when he was around. One evening, while having a family dinner at one of our local go-to sit-downs, she started kicking me under the table, passing me horribly evil glares. After a few minutes of this, she spoke up. "You chew like a cow. Why can't you chew right? Doesn't she chew like a cow?" My dad chuckled, thinking it was meant lightheartedly, but as he looked down at his meal again, her death glare staring a hole through me with a tight jaw and grit teeth told me otherwise. This became a new target for her abuse. She did this again later when she noticed that I walked on the inside of my house shoes, one day kicking me in the back of my knees and making me fall to the floor. She began kicking me in the back, knocking the wind out of me, all over the simple way that I walked. This became daily life. Speaking out seemed ridiculous because all of these punishments just felt so absurd. I didn't tell anyone for a long time, but as I got older, the people around me got wiser. When I was in middle school, my dad and stepmother were called in for questioning by the school. 2 of my teachers were highly suspicious of my bruises and constantly swollen fingers. Stepmother proceeded to put on an act, crying and acting hurt and shocked they would even think she would hurt a child. I changed schools after that year. Things got worse when I went to high school. She seemed to be intimidated by my aging and gaining maturity. Male friends were off limits, and my curves were to be hidden by horribly unflattering clothes. I really didn't mind that so much, as I had little interest in boys or displaying my womanhood to any degree. However, one afternoon while taking a shower, she burst into the bathroom to remind me of my timing. As she whipped the bathtub curtain open, she saw the hair growing below my waist. Before I could react, she grabbed the hair and jerked it down, pulling out a handful of my pubic hair. She cursed me for not telling her I had started maturing in that way. I couldn't tell anyone about that for years. After the belt beating, however, stepmother's sister-in-law saw my backside and called my dad at work, cursing him and threatening to report it. I started going to her house on the weekends after that. After this, someone standing up for me. I got braver and became less scared. Once I saw people reacting to what little they saw of my stepmother's behavior, I knew I was in the right for sticking up for myself. So I did. In subtle ways at first. Brought jewelry and makeup to school and started to give myself space to express myself. Then one morning, while running a minute or two behind on breakfast, stepmother came into the kitchen in a rage. Why wasn't I finishing getting ready for school? Before I could turn around from rinsing my dishes, she was rummaging in the utensil drawer and pulled out a fork. She backed me against the kitchen counter, pressing it to my throat. I don't remember what she said to me in those moments, but I remember her hot breath in my ear hissing through her teeth at me. I remember the chill of the cold metal prongs on my throat. I was only 16. My last day there was field day of my junior year. I decided to wear a cute outfit that her sister-in-law had bought me for casual days. It was a cute cap-sleeved striped t-shirt, cut femininely to suit my curves with long matching shorts. I knew she wouldn't like it, but I also knew it was completely appropriate for a girl my age, even very conservative in comparison to most of my other peers. She saw me as I was walking down the hallway towards my bedroom, and I saw the rage fill her. She came at me nails first, grabbing my arms and digging them in. This was when I snapped. I fought her off and shoved her into the wall. Rage filled me as I went to the living room to grab the phone. "If you ever touch me again, I'm going to call the cops." She went pale, and suddenly I wasn't so scared for myself anymore. I couldn't control myself and laughed when I saw. "You're scared," I said, suddenly enlightened. Her face went blank as she walked toward me. "If I have to make your dad choose between you or me, you know it's not going to be you," she said coldly. I ignored this sentiment though, because I knew she was delusional to think something like that. I went to my bedroom and packed a bag. She didn't stop me, but she did make sure to let me know that if I left, I wasn't welcome back. I ended up spending that summer in Florida with my stepmother's sister-in-law and moved in with my grandmother for the next several years. I only saw her again once in my 20s. She had left my dad by the time I was out of high school for the man she had been cheating on him with the entire time. She and I spoke briefly over Facebook in that next year, and I confronted her about what she had put me and my dad through. Her response: "I'm sorry if you ever felt unloved. I was just really stressed, and you were a pretty rebellious kid." When I was in 3rd grade, I made a friend named Nicholas, Nicky for short. We were both on the quieter side compared to our classmates, and we both shared a love for pudding cups. One day at school, Nicky forgot his lunch at home, so I told him he could have my pudding cup instead. And that's how we first became friends. From that moment on, we shared my pudding cups every day. The other kids in our class used to tease us, accusing us of having crushes on each other, and chant that horrible KISSING song all the time. It had become customary for Nicky and I to separate ourselves from the other kids at recess and lunch. We had a big tree we would always meet under in the morning, at recess, and for a few minutes after school before our parents came to pick us up. Nicky lived with his older sister and single mother. He tried explaining the concept of divorce to me once, but in my 8-year-old mind it didn't make sense that his parents weren't still together, happily married. As you can imagine, my parents were married, and my home life was the epitome of the adoring nuclear family. Imagine Full House except with a mother who hadn't passed away yet, and a couple of cousins instead of uncles. I can't recall a single moment in my childhood where I felt unloved or uncared for in any way. I very soon realized that that was a rarity. During one of mine and Nicky's morning visits to the tree, as we had cleverly nicknamed it, he invited me to his birthday party. He excitedly unzipped his backpack and withdrew an invitation card made of blue construction paper. There was this big hand-drawn tree on the front, 2 little kids of approximately mine and Nicky's size and coloring, and a home address scribbled inside. To this day, I still have that card. When the bell rang, he and I ran inside with the rest of the kids, and I waited all day for him to give out the rest of his birthday invitations. but he never did. I was the only one he had invited. Because the other kids teased us so much, my 8-year-old mind had chalked it up to the conclusion that he didn't want any bullies there, and had therefore invited his only friend, me. Suffice to say, I was very flattered and happy. I gave the card to my mother later on in the evening. She smiled and said, "How cute," and very quickly gave me permission to go. It was actually my first non-family birthday party. The next day, I went to the store with my mother and older brother, and we picked out a birthday present for Nicky. He and I were both heavily into Transformers, so we got him this tiny one after getting permission from his mother. I wrapped it up in blue wrapping paper all by myself. His birthday was on the following Saturday. My mother dropped me off at Nicky's house, briefly speaking with his mother in the kitchen, discussing pickup times and how fast we were growing before kissing me on the forehead goodbye. Because Nicky, his sister, and I were the only ones there, we decided to play a couple of board games and then tag when it wasn't raining anymore. We were in the backyard. It got to be a little sunny after, and Nicky and I fell deep into our dramatic reenactment of the latest and most exciting Power Rangers episode to date. That we had seen, at least. His sister, a preteen at the time, went inside for a minute to check something, which Nicky would later reveal to me was a code phrase she used when she wanted to talk to the cute neighbor boy on the phone. Inside the kitchen, his mother was cooking and keeping an eye on us through the window. It was only as we went inside to eat that I realized there were no decorations. In fact, there wasn't anything to signify that it was Nicky's birthday at all, except for the homemade chocolate cake. I had loosely gathered that Nicky's family didn't have a lot of money, and that maybe that was the reason he went to school without lunch so often. But I'd never really asked him about it, and he never said anything either. Not that an 8-year-old would do either of those things. We went down to the basement after we cut the cake and took a couple of photos, where there was a tiny TV and an SNES. We played video games for roughly 10 minutes before there was this loud knock at the door. Nicky stopped the game, Yoshi's Island, and jogged up the basement stairs to answer the door, eventually screaming, "Dad, I thought you wouldn't come." He was very excited, understandably so considering how rarely he saw his father and what a big occasion it was in his life when he did. He would always tell me about it at school, that his cool, fun dad came to visit and took him for a ride around the block on his motorcycle. For a while, I'll admit I wasn't sure if I believed his dad owned a motorcycle, but when Nicky came down to introduce me to him, I followed them outside into the front yard and saw this big black Harley parked in the driveway. There were 2 helmets, one for his dad and one for him. I was instantly jealous. My own father drove a minivan and wore polo shirts and cargo pants almost religiously. Nicky's dad, however, was the complete and total opposite of mine. He wasn't suburban at all. In fact, he looked just like a character out of The Outsiders. Right away, I thought he was real cool, and right away I wanted to fit in with them. I should also note that Nicky and I came from different ethnic backgrounds. He was white, I was not. Because I went to school with a majority of white kids and lived in a town with a majority white population, I found it very difficult to fit in sometimes. That was part of the reason I had grown so close to Nicky so quickly. He was pretty much the only kid in school who gave me the time of day, and I him. The other kids didn't like me because I looked different, and they didn't like Nicky because he wore old, faded clothes. He was raised on a modest salary. His mother had a few jobs, if I remember correctly. She was a waitress, a grocery store clerk, and a part-time janitor. For a single mother with 2 growing kids, a house, and a car that was always breaking down, she was really quite optimistic. I liked her quite a lot, actually. She was always really nice. Even when she caught one of the bullies in school shoving Nicky to the ground once, she was nice. So when she immediately wasn't nice to Nicky's father, and when she pulled him aside to ask him to leave the party right away, I couldn't help but wonder what was going on. My mother picked me up soon after, and I made a pact with Nicky that I would come over again very soon. Because my mother had finally met his in person and spoken with her, I was allowed to come over and play now. Before that, she would always tell me, not until I meet his mother. From that point on, I went over to Nicky's house 2 or 3 times every week. Sometimes his mother would be there. Sometimes his older sister would be there. One of them was always there to look after us and make sure we didn't get up to any trouble. We would usually just go down to his basement and play video games, or when the weather would allow it, we would ride bikes in the cul-de-sac and jump on his tiny trampoline. He was always better at flips than me, and my child mind kind of resented him for it. One time he tried to teach me how to front flip and I nearly landed on my head. The second I got to my feet, I ran away and started crying, mostly due to embarrassment. I just wanted Nicky to think I could hang, but I couldn't really do any of the cool things he could. My own parents thought those kinds of things were too dangerous and forbid me from jumping on Nicky's trampoline. I used to always do it though. Kids will be kids. Nicky seemed to think I was cool enough though, and to get my crybaby ass to feel better, he would admit that he was a little bit jealous of me. Jealous of my new clothes, my new bike, just everything new that I had. That was the first time he opened up to me about being less privileged. The SNES in his basement was an old gift from a cousin of his who lived in the next town over, but it barely worked half the time. That's probably why his cousin gave it away in the first place. We sat in his basement for a few minutes talking about all the little reasons we were jealous of each other. Then his sister came down to say she was going to the mall with her friends, but their dad was coming over to look after us. Their mother was at work that afternoon. For whatever reason, Nicky was shocked to hear his dad was coming over. I took it as a surprise visit and ran outside with Nicky when we heard the motorcycle. Indeed, his dad was there, and he also had a late birthday present for Nicky in his hands. It was a box, roughly the size of his head, and it was wrapped in a newspaper. When we went inside to open it, he made Nicky promise not to tell his mother what he'd gotten him. Apparently, his mother didn't want Nicky to get a present from his dad, but his dad had bought him something anyway. Nicky readily nodded, so I followed his lead. I watched Nicky tear the newspaper to shreds, revealing a brand new Polaroid camera. Nicky had no idea what it was at first, looking to his dad for answers, before I excitedly said, "A camera! You got a camera!" I could tell Nicky felt embarrassed he didn't know what it was right away, but he was just so happy to get something. He brushed the embarrassment aside and we opened the box to play with it. His dad taught us how to use it and explained how it worked to us as well. He pointed it at Nicky and snapped the first photo, flapping it in the air after, and showing us the final product. It was so cool to me that the photos just came out right away. My family had a camera too, but we had to wait for the photos to get developed at the store. By that time, I'd always forget and lose interest. But Nicky's new Polaroid camera printed photos out right away. Nicky loved it, and I loved it. His dad really seemed to love it too. When his dad pointed the camera at me, I smiled like a dork and we all laughed at the photo after. My front teeth were missing at the time and I looked like I was high pretty much. Nicky and I traded our photos after. He kept the photo of me and I kept the photo of him. We said we'd be friends for as long as we kept these photos of each other intact, so I took extra good care of mine. Now that we had this new toy to play with, I was always asking to go over to Nicky's. Because I lived in a house with so many other family members and relatives, I felt lost there sometimes. When I went to Nicky's, I felt more like I belonged. It was always quieter there too. It was the mid-90s at the time, so parents were less strict with their young children, and mine allowed me to spend hours and hours at Nicky's as long as his mother was okay with it too. She always was. She loved having me around because she knew how happy it made Nicky to have a friend to hang out with. My mother would frequently send me to Nicky's house with some sort of dish or snack. She even invited Nicky's family to my house for dinner once. My family really liked his family. I think my older brother even had a tiny crush on his older sister, but she was all about that neighbor boy, so tough luck, bro. For this reason, I was allowed to go to Nicky's house almost every day now. He didn't live too far away either. We were well within walking distance of each other, maybe only 5 blocks away. His house was one of the few places I knew how to get to on my own, apart from my own house. There were times I would go straight to his house with him from school, and times he would come over to play with me at mine. One day at school, Nicky told me his dad had come over the other night and got mad at him for not taking any new photos with a Polaroid he got for his birthday. Both Nicky and I had loved that thing and thought it was very cool the first few times we played around with it, but as most kids do, we eventually lost interest in it. Nicky just sort of tucked it under a blanket in the basement and forgot all about it. I guess his dad didn't like that very much. Nicky asked me if I'd help him take photos for the next time his dad came to visit. In fact, his dad was very specific in requesting that I be in all the photos. I found this perfectly normal as an 8-year-old. I figured Nicky's dad wanted us to have fun with the camera and immortalize our friendship, maybe make a scrapbook or something. Up until this point, Nicky's mother and sister still had no idea he'd ever gotten it. I agreed I would come over soon, and we would take a bunch of silly photos together. But Nicky forgot to mention one thing to me. He forgot to mention his dad would be there. It was the same story as last time. His mother was working, his sister at the mall with friends, presumably with money their dad gave her, and their mother had no way of knowing any of this was going on. I went over there after school and noticed the motorcycle parked out front. Nicky didn't seem surprised to see it, but something about his mood was off that day. I figured it was because he got in trouble the last time he saw his dad. Because it was raining a little, we went inside to hang out in the basement, where I thought we would play on the SNES for a bit. But that wasn't the plan at all. Nicky's dad was in the basement. He greeted me with a big smile and asked how school was, if we did anything fun at recess, what kind of things we learned in class, the usual. I thought nothing of it. My parents would always ask me similar questions too. Eventually, Nicky's dad said we should start taking photos, so I obliged. I smiled widely for the camera, but instead of pressing the button and laughing at the photo like we had done the other day, Nicky's dad tutted at me and said I should try to look prettier. I had no idea what he could mean by that, so I just smiled a little smaller and held it for a second before he corrected me again. As you can imagine, he kept at it, nitpicking me until I let my hair down, telling me to pitch my cheeks before every photo to make sure they were flushed, rosy, and pretty. This whole time, he didn't take a single photo of Nicky. Because it's been decades since, and because I've somehow managed to block most of this out, I'm not entirely sure what led up to it, but Nicky's dad eventually convinced me to start taking articles of clothing off. First my jacket, then my socks, then my cardigan, and then he asked Nicky to get in the frame. This whole time, Nicky had been standing off to the side, not saying a word, and not looking at me either. It looked like he felt something was wrong, but he was too afraid to say so. What ended up happening is exactly what you think. First, Nicky was told to hold my hands, then hug me, then put his face really close to mine. Then he was told to kiss me on the mouth. His dad snapped photos of it every step of the way, asking Nicky these questions like, "Isn't she pretty? Don't you think she's pretty, Nick? Do you want to take her on dates?" It was a whole lot of that and a whole lot of touching. The whole time I stood completely still, not sure what was exactly happening. Had any other boy been there with me, I'm not sure I would have remained so calm. But because it was with Nicky, I felt somewhat safe. I didn't feel like we were doing anything wrong. The kiss was gross to me, but everything else I was mostly okay with. We stopped pretty quickly after that kiss, not because his dad wanted to, but because I had to go home. My mother had just come to pick me up. Usually my brother would, so he could talk to Nicky's sister a little bit, but he had basketball practice that day, so my mother came instead. For some reason, Nicky's dad didn't go up to answer the door. He asked Nicky to do it. I took a second to grab my jacket and sweater and put them back on. During this time, while Nicky's dad and I were alone in the basement, he said he would come back to take more photos one day, and that I should wear makeup next time. I didn't have any at 8 years old, but I didn't tell him that. I just collected my things and got out of there to go home. I saw my mother at the door and she hugged me, asking how my day was, and suddenly everything was normal again. For me, anyway. I glanced back to wave bye to Nicky, but he had already shut the door behind. The next day at school, he completely ignored me. I went to that tree we shared and waited there all morning, all recess, even an extra 15 minutes after school. But he never showed up. I saw him in class, so I knew he was at school. He just didn't want to hang out with me for some reason. This carried on for the rest of the week, until one day my mother got a phone call from Nicky's. I was in the living room watching wrestling with my brother, and I vividly remember my mother's smile immediately vanishing as she listened on the phone to whatever Nikki's mother was saying. I remember asking what was wrong. Was Nikki sick? But my mother wouldn't say anything to me. She just nodded and listened and nodded, face draining of color, as though she had seen a ghost. She pulled me aside to speak with me in my bedroom and asked me very clearly, "Sweetie, who was there at Nick's house the other day? Was it his sister Angela or someone else?" As soon as I said someone else, her eyes became filled with water, and she asked me what happened. I was vague on the details because I wasn't really sure what had happened myself. It was such a blur to me at the time. The only thing I was really worried about was Nicky. Why had he been ignoring me? Because I didn't want him to be more mad at me and ignore me for longer, I kept quiet about that camera, saying Nicky's dad had watched us play and told me I was pretty. Apparently, that last part was enough to set off a huge red flag in my mother's mind. She gave me a big hug and told me she wasn't mad at me and that everything would be okay really soon. I later learned what really happened. Apparently, Nicky's mother had found the camera, asked Angela about it, and then Nicky, quickly learning that their dad had been coming over without her knowledge. The rule was that he could only visit when she was home, but the past few times she hadn't been. The very next day, I found Nicky under the tree at school. He very seriously told me we could not be friends anymore. When I asked him why, he said, just because. He even went so far as giving me back the Polaroid of me smiling like a dork, the one I exchanged for the Polaroid of him, both of them signifying our friendship. Because nothing had really happened, because the world was a very different place 20 years ago, and because the photos weren't explicit in nature. Nothing happened to Nicky's dad. But that's not for lack of trying on our mother's parts. I remember going to the police station, telling them everything as my mother sat there beside me, repeating the story again and again to various lawyers. But the most we were able to accomplish was preventing Nicky's dad from seeing Nicky and Angela again. Apparently, by coming to the house when Nicky's mother wasn't there, he had violated the terms of their custody agreement. When it was all over, the meetings and everything else, Nicky and his family ended up moving. Apparently, Nicky knew this was going to happen, and that's why he told me we couldn't be friends anymore. I want to say I managed to give him the photo back before he left, that we shared one last pudding cup, but I can't, because those things never happened. He moved, and I stayed. And for a really, really long time, I sat alone there at that tree during recess. Eventually, I made new friends. Eventually, I stopped waiting for him to come back. Eventually, I was a happy kid again. But I never, not once in my life, forgot about Nicky or what happened in his basement that day. The way everything about him just changed so drastically. If it weren't for his dad, I like to think we would have remained friends, at least through childhood. The silver lining, though, is that social media exists, and when I was 17, I found a friend request from a boy named Nicky in my notifications. But to Nicky's dad, let's not ever meet again. In 2010, I was driving from New Orleans, Louisiana to Eugene, Oregon. It was just me, 24 and female, and my 2-year-old pit bull, in a 14-foot U-Haul truck with everything I owned crammed into the back. I had my fancy flip phone and my printout of MapQuest directions. I think the first smartphones actually came out around this time, but I actually didn't have one yet. Cell phone service was also much spottier at the time, and there were long stretches through the desert where I had zero service for hundreds of miles. I was driving a lonely stretch of highway through central Texas when I realized I hadn't seen a town or exit for a very long time, and my giant U-Haul truck was really low on gas. Just when I'm starting to freak out though and seriously run low, I see a small town coming up ahead. I pull into this town and it is absolutely tiny. I was so worried about other things that I never did pay attention to the name of the town, but there must have been only 6 streets in the entire place. I go gas up and I get ready to head back onto the road. Except I cannot for the life of me find my way back to the highway now. I circle the town about 4 times and start getting frustrated. This is such a tiny town. How the hell can I not find my way out? I can literally see where the highway is, but somehow I just can't find the way to get to it. I return to the gas station to ask for directions. Now, when I first got gas, I paid at the pump and never actually went in. When I enter for directions, there's this skinny, nondescript guy who has black hair hanging down in front of his eyes. He really looked like he could use a good wash. He was not particularly creepy per se, but he was a little bit rude. He never really met my eyes. Instead, he was looking down at a magazine the entire time. He also gave me directions that really didn't sound right at all. He's telling me to take a road that will get me to the highway in about 17 miles. For a moment, I was dumbfounded. I pointed out quickly that I hadn't driven that far in the first place to get from the highway into town, so why would it be so far back to the highway? I could literally see where it was. I could literally see the location of the highway. He was so casual, almost like I was being an annoyance. He said I could follow his directions or not. Why should I care? He gave me some explanation about the road curving around that really didn't make much sense at all. He also still refused to look at me. Just, whatever, I gave you your directions and waved his hand in the direction of the door. When I got into the parking lot, my whole body started trembling violently, and my heart started racing suddenly, seemingly for no reason. I got into the truck, and as soon as I put the key into the ignition, I burst into tears. I had this terrible feeling that no matter how nonchalant he acted, this man had bad intentions with those directions. I didn't know what exactly they were, but I knew right then and there that there was no way I was going to follow those bogus directions. And yet, this was the only store in this little town. And short of knocking on every door, no thank you. There was no one else to ask for directions. I decided I really didn't give a shit if this town seemed like something that dropped straight out of the Twilight Zone. I was going to drive around until I found my way out, even if it took all damn night. At this moment, a big beater of a pickup truck, as much rust as metal, pulled in and disgorged the quintessential Texan man. Huge, husky, and in flannel work boots. Without even thinking about it, I jumped out of the truck and approached him quickly, yet warily. Looking into his eyes, though, I could see he was a kind human being, or at least I was hoping so. I asked him if he could please give me directions to the highway. I told him I knew it was silly, but I just couldn't seem to find my way back somehow. Thankfully, he looked very concerned as I was visibly upset, so he made me laugh and very cheerfully gave me directions for a hairpin curved turnoff right at the end of the small concrete tunnel I had passed by several times. He said it was common. It often confused travelers because it was so hard to see from the outside. He said they'd need to put up some signs sometime soon. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I asked him how far in miles it was back to the highway. He laughed and gave me this funny look. "Miles, miss? I'd say it's a quarter-mile at most. I mean, you can see the highway right from here." At this point, I couldn't help it. I had to know. "Well, what happens if I drive here?" I gave him the directions the man in the store had just given me. Texas looked at me very intently and asked me how I even knew about that route. It was pretty far out, and usually only locals knew about it, so I told him. He was very quiet for a few minutes, then asked what the attendant had looked like and if I had a map of the state. No, just my MapQuest map, which wasn't very helpful in this situation. He goes to his truck and grabs a raggedy local map from his glove box. Spreading it out for me, he traces the route I described to him. The way the man from the gas station had told me to go led directly away from town, away from the interstate, and led seemingly right into the middle of nowhere. Texas told me that the road did go about 17 miles, right before it dead-ended in the middle of the desert. I asked him what was out there. He told me it was nothing but some junked cars and a few trailers and mobile homes, all owned by the same family. This family was known locally as troublemakers, meth heads, and alcoholics. and these were the nice things the townspeople had to say about them. The erstwhile clerk was a part of this family and lived down that road. I'll never forget the look in Texas's eyes as he told me this. He also told me I was very smart to listen to my instincts and told me to be careful traveling out there from now on. I don't know if the man from the gas station wanted what was in the back of my U-Haul or what was in the driver's seat, but thankfully I didn't have to find out. Oh, and I also learned that sometimes angels look like ruddy-haired Texans with scruffy faces and rusty pickups. Thank you, random Texan stranger. You really saved my ass, and I'll always remember you with tons of love. I'm sorry I didn't ask for your name at the time. You're forever Texas to me now. This was about 4 or 5-ish years ago. Back then, I lived with my mother in a shed on a farm surrounded by woodland. Our farmland was part of a larger piece of farmland that was split up and sold off, so we did have neighbors, though they were roughly half a kilometer away each. We loved that though because of the privacy. So it wasn't like there was nobody nearby I could go to if I needed help. That thought is what had me fearlessly walking alone at night between the hours of 7 and 8 p.m. sometimes, fluctuating from earlier to later depending on the day. Sometimes I even went out on a walk at 2 a.m. in the morning because I was restless and couldn't sleep. Looking back, this was probably incredibly stupid, and after this incident I never walked after 6 p.m. ever again, always making sure there was at least some sunlight left whenever I set out. The route I always took was a road circuit. The first part was out in the open in front of all the other farms, including my own. If anything had happened, at least one person would have noticed, and reception was pretty good as well, so I would have been able to call someone. The second half, on the other hand, was concealed by about 200 meters of woods between the farms and the back road, stretching the full 2 kilometers at the back of the farm. It was during that part of the walk when I had this creepy encounter. It was late at night. I can't remember exactly what time, but I do know it was pitch black with the exception of my torchlight. I was about to approach the turn in the loop that would bring me out into the open again when I heard it. Help. It was this monotone voice that repeatedly asked for help. It didn't seem panicked in the least. I took my headphones out and turned my music off to make sure I was hearing correctly, but it didn't stop. Help. Help. A very stupid part of me almost responded, because for some reason my first instinct was, oh no, someone's in trouble, like a naive kid, although I would have been about 16 or 17 at the time. Of course, my rational brain kicked in and realized that approaching a random voice was just about the stupidest thing I could do. I started quietly backing away. Unfortunately, my cat had also followed me on this walk and was not backing away with me. No, she was walking toward the voice, softly hissing. I remember desperately trying to get her to come back towards me without alerting the voice to my presence, just in case they hadn't noticed me yet. I was getting scared and didn't want to stay there a moment more, so I ran forwards and grabbed her, then turned around and bolted back towards my house. I don't know if it was stupid of me to turn my back to the voice as I was making so much noise while running. There would have been no way they wouldn't have known I was there, and I would have had no way of knowing if they were giving chase. I was so terrified the entire time. The image of someone cloaked in shadows, chasing me entered my mind, even though I couldn't hear anyone behind me. I never once slowed down until I was back safe and sound within my own home. The story doesn't end there, though. Despite how terrifying that experience was, there was still a part of me that was concerned about whoever it was that was asking for help, because what if they really needed it? So I asked my mother to drive us to the location, another very stupid decision considering what we found, that being a whole lot of nothing. We called out and called out to the person, but nobody ever answered. We didn't get out of the car though. Luckily, neither of us were that stupid. We drove home having seen nothing, and no one. It still bothered me in the morning though, so I had my mother drive us over again, and we searched the immediate area. Nothing. No indication anyone had ever been there. There was no body either, which was admittedly a drastic thing to search for. But I know shock can leave you eerily calm, which could have explained the monotone voice, and the lack of response afterwards made me fear we'd been too late, and we'd find a dead person in the morning. I don't know if I would have preferred that outcome, but then at least I would have had a face to put to the voice. But no, we found absolutely nothing, and to this day I have no idea who that voice belonged to, and why they were so monotonously calling out for help. My mind has naturally come to some chilling conclusions and theories that leave me unable to sleep. Perhaps a rapist, a kidnapper, a serial killer, all the classic horror stories. But I guess I'll never really know for sure. Before COVID-19 hit the United States, I was going to college in a city a few hours away from my hometown. I was living in an apartment in said city with a good friend from high school. There was this one weekend where she went home to visit her family, and I had to stay back due to the fact that I had to work that weekend. This was a Friday, and I had the day off, so after school I decided to relax and watch some true crime. I'm in the kitchen making dinner at around 6:30 or 7 when I hear this loud knock at my door. I immediately freeze, something I wouldn't normally do. I just had this really odd feeling that somehow I should not answer no matter what. I tried to stay quiet, and I waited and tried to listen to what was happening outside from my kitchen. There was another really loud knock, followed by someone shouting, "Apartment check for my apartment number." This was when I knew something was off. It was almost 7 p.m., and the apartment's office, maintenance, and anything else involving the apartment complex closed by 4. I simply stayed quiet until I knew they were gone. After they moved from my apartment, though, I heard them do this to the next 2 apartments down the hall from me, once again stating, "Apartment check for apartment number." I went on with my night and didn't think too much about it after. However, I was definitely more alert for the rest of the night, especially due to the fact that I was there all alone. Later that evening, I had to go to the 7-Eleven across the street from my apartment. I drove because the area I lived in was extremely questionable, to put it nicely, especially for a female at night. As I'm driving back to my apartment, I see 4 or 5 cop cars right outside my building. I also notice a man is handcuffed, and they're placing him in the back seat. I don't know if this was related, but I had a very strong feeling that it was. I'm not sure what exactly the purpose of this apartment check scam was. I thought maybe it was someone with intentions of robbing the place, who wanted to pose as a worker at the apartment to scope it out. I'll never know for sure what their intentions were, but I'm very glad I didn't decide to answer that door. I'll try not to make this too long, but I want to put this out there for kids and parents alike. Not even your employer can be trusted. This was the summer of 2004. I was 15 at the time and working weekends at a skate park, running the registers and keeping up shop. I was the only female employee there. The reason I got the job, I thought at the time, was because I used to hang out there a lot prior to being offered a position. They also used to host events and hardcore rock shows a ton. Those were extremely fun and the place where all my friends gathered for a good time, so we got to know the owners pretty well. The 2 guys that owned the shop were in their 40s, overweight and balding, typical older white guys, but they were extremely nice. Let's call them Doug and Mark. Now Doug was always more serious about the business, always trying to come up with new ideas to better it and rarely joking around. He was also married with kids. Mark, on the other hand, well, he seemed a lot like Doug's minion. He was always out running errands, making calls, or cleaning up the shop. He was a single guy. He was very outgoing and silly, so we always had a lot of fun with him around, until one day, when the fun stopped. Before I tell you about the scariest moment in my life, I'll inform you of the events, or I'd like to call them red flags, leading up to it. On one occasion, we were hosting a show where a local metal band was playing. There were lots of people there, kids and adults alike. They were skating and running up and down the ramps and bowls, just generally having a really good time. Then Mark suddenly came up behind me as I was talking to my friend Katie. He picked me up and swung me over his shoulder and started tickling and spinning me around, right in the middle of the crowd. I laughed it off and was yelling for him to stop in a giggly voice, but I was honestly pretty creeped out. He had never touched me before, even in a friendly way. Even at 15 years old, I found this very inappropriate for a man in his 40s to be so touchy on me. After about a minute, he put me down and was laughing and apologizing. I didn't think so much of it anymore. I thought maybe I was just overreacting. A week or two went by, and I noticed Mark was starting to give me flirty looks and sticking his tongue out at me when he was around. Again, I didn't think too much of it. He had always been such a nice guy. I thought he was just trying to be funny. One day, Mark called me into the back. We had 2 doors behind the register that led to our stock room, as Doug sat on a register on a business call. When we got to the back room, he picked me up, set me on the washing machine, and told me he really wanted to kiss me. I automatically shut him down. He then tried to persuade me to lift up my shirt for him. At this point, I really freaked out. I was hoping Doug would come through those doors any second and help me. Again, I firmly told him no as I hopped down and proceeded to walk to the shop front again. That's when Doug opens the door. "Hey, what are you guys doing? Did Mark show you our butterfly collection?" I just responded with a confused, nah, and walked out. The 2 followed me. The rest of the day was pretty uneventful. I just really wanted it to end. I usually got off work around 6 or 7. But around 5, Doug asked me to go with Mark to run some errands. He jokingly said, "Take my credit card, but don't give it to Mark." All I could really think about was how awkward this ride was going to be. We hadn't talked at all since the incident earlier that day. I was really dreading this trip, but I had no idea what was about to unfold. So we get in the car and drive to my high school, which is on the other side of town. A medium-sized busy city, but about 5 minutes away from my house. As we pull in the back parking lot on a Saturday, I ask him just what we're doing here. He responds by saying, "I'm scouting out a new area for a skate park. It's behind the school here." This is when I started to get nervous. I was hoping it was true because I did know they were trying to expand locations at the time. He gets out of the car and motions for me to get out and come along. I hesitantly do so. We start walking to the back of the school. Now he's just talking about his visions of the park, nothing too serious. That's when we approach the woods. Not a wooded area, straight up dense forest-like woods that you could barely even walk through. That's when he says, "Take my hand, come on, I'll show you to the spot." This is when the alarms go off in my head, and I realized I could be in real danger if I went with him. In my head, I was contemplating running, or just going along with him. I didn't know which one would make the situation worse at the time. I now know I should have run away. This pondering seemed like it went on forever, when in reality it was probably only a few seconds. Thank God I paused a second before making any decisions, because that's exactly when my cell phone rang. I honestly forgot I had it on me. It was my mom asking if she could come pick me up early so we could go to dinner together. That's when I told her with a sense of urgency, "Yes, I'm at the high school. Come get me now." I think she could hear the fear in my voice and left immediately because she was there in less than 5 minutes. During those 5 minutes, I told Mark I had to go and wait on my mom. He seemed very agitated, but agreed and walked me to the front steps of the school to wait. He didn't even say bye or anything. He just walked briskly to his car and took off. My mom showed up a couple of minutes later. I hopped in quicker than I've ever done anything in my life. I know I must have been shaking real bad. I told her I was not in the mood to eat and to just drop me off at home. She asked me if I was okay. I said yes and that I and a coworker were just scouting for a new spot. I got dropped off at home and was in shock and fear. I quit working there that very day. I just never went back. I didn't explain anything to anyone, and I've only told my boyfriend and a couple of friends about this. I'm 100% convinced, looking back on all of the red flags, and the fact that Doug didn't seem to trust Mark and was actually a good guy, that if I had went into those woods, I wouldn't be here today. Who knows what he would have done to me? Rape? Murder? Both? It's weird when you survive something like that. It never really seemed real to me, but it very much was. I myself have a 12-year-old daughter now, and I try to teach her about safety and predators all the time. That kind of thing can change you, and change the parent you become as well. As an update to this, that was about 2 years later, Mark called my house phone. No idea how he got my number even. He told me he was in Istanbul, Turkey, and about to open a skate shop there. I just told him to please not call me anymore and hung up. Luckily, the nightmare was over after that, but hearing from him suddenly was like talking to the devil again. I hope that man is dead or in jail so he couldn't hurt anyone else. I always wonder if Doug ever found out about Mark. Maybe Mark had to flee the country for a crime he committed or something, and that's why he was in Istanbul. This turned out to be longer than intended, but point is, as a woman or girl especially, never trust anyone who's been a creep to you. I don't trust much of anyone anymore. Full disclosure, this happened 10 years ago, but I still can't believe how lucky I was to get away. I was 16 and female, running late for school as usual. Walking down the road, I noticed a dark green car with tinted windows slowly following behind me. This was a residential community, and it was not unusual for people to drive by slowly. It was around 9 a.m. on a weekday, so I naively figured there was no danger as I hurried toward the bus stop. Arriving at the stop, it had just started to rain, so I decided to stand in the small glass bus shelter to wait for the bus. The creepy green car stopped right in front of the bus stop. The driver got out and approached me in the bus shelter. Now, this bus shelter was so small, there was only room for 2 people. He stood at the entrance and grabbed each side of the shelter, trapping me inside. He was very large and extremely physically intimidating. Something about his dead eyes sent chills through my entire body. He asked if I was familiar with the area. I responded that yes, I was. He asked if I was going to school. I responded again that yes, I was. He then asked if he could drive me to school so I could show him the way. Call it intuition, but something in my head was screaming not to get in the car with him. I politely declined his offer and asked if he needed help with directions or something else. He suddenly lunged at me, grabbing my arm. He pulled me out of the bus shelter towards his car. I started screaming, as he kept insisting it would be faster to drive. Somehow though, by the grace of God, the bus pulled up at this exact moment. All my instincts told me to fight. I clawed at his face. I kicked him. I bit him. I contorted my body until he loosened his grip on my arm. Once free, I leapt on that bus as though my life depended on it, which it very well may have. The bus driver asked if I was okay right away, but I didn't even have time to reply. I ran to the back to find a seat, and cried quietly in the corner as the bus carried me off to school. All day I sat in class and said nothing about what happened to me. When I got home from school, though, I told my parents what had happened. They were horrified, especially after I showed them the bruise from the man's hand on my arm. We called the police. The officer arrived late that evening and took my statement. He said there had been several similar incidents in the area. He asked if I could come down to the station and look at some pictures to identify the culprit. The following week, my mom and I head into the police station. The officer sets us up with a computer, and we start to scroll through the mugshots. There were so many. Not only was it discouraging to realize just how many known sex offenders there were close by, but after a while, All the faces just started to blur together. Losing hope of identifying the man, we were just about to give up when I recognized his dead eyes in one of the pictures. The officers asked me if I was sure. I confirmed it was him, but he had since grown a long beard since the photo was taken. They thanked me and said they would call if needed. 2 weeks later, the news announced the police had apprehended the man suspected of kidnapping and assaulting several young girls in the area. The news story included his mugshot. It was the same man I had identified. He was caught with one of his underage victims still in his car. It took years for the gravity of this incident to truly hit me. Had the bus arrived any later, had I not been able to twist myself out of his grasp, had he grabbed me while I was walking and didn't see him, so many ways this could have turned out differently. I was so fortunate, while others were not. When I was a teenager, I lived in a small town located about 30 miles south of Atlanta, Georgia. I did not get my license or my first car until I was almost 20 years old, so between the ages of 16 and 19, I hitchhiked very frequently. This was in the early 70s, when people still hitchhiked a lot, and many drivers were still willing to pick people up, in spite of the dangers and risks posed to both driver and rider. For the most part, I never had any trouble with the people who offered me rides. Occasionally, though, I would get picked up by someone who would really creep me out. This is a story about one such creepy ride I accepted, and about how 25 years later, I would discover to my great shock that I may have been much luckier at the time than I ever imagined. This incident occurred sometime in the summer of 1974, when I was around 17 years old. At that time, I was a 6-foot-tall, 175-pound, blonde-hair and blue-eyed guy who had no trouble connecting with girls for dates. In fact, my story begins with me standing on the side of the highway with my thumb out. I was trying to get back home after spending the weekend with my girlfriend, who lived in downtown Atlanta. I was traveling south, away from the city and out into the country where I lived with my parents. I recall I had only had my thumb out for about 15 minutes when this man in a big white Lincoln Town Car, a very large and expensive car at the time, pulled over beside me. As I walked up to this car, I scanned the inside and looked at the driver, trying to size up the situation as I always did, just to be safe. What I saw was a tidy car with a man in the driver's seat who looked to be in his late 30s or mid-40s, dressed in an expensive suit and tie. He had short black hair, wore black-rimmed eyeglasses, and appeared to be rather on the thin side, with a very gaunt face and dark eyes. I never did learn his name, but for the sake of this story, I'll call him Town Car Man. When I got up to the passenger side of the car, I leaned down toward the open window and told him where I was heading to. I asked him if he was going that way, to which he replied that he was in a soft voice and waved me in. I was not all that wary of him, as by all appearances he was just an ordinary middle-class businessman. I opened the door and got into the front seat next to him without any hesitation. Generally, when I accepted rides from strangers while hitchhiking, I like to try and engage them in chat, sort of as a way to pay them for the ride by providing good conversation, and maybe also put them at ease about picking me up by showing them I was harmless and not a creep. Even though I felt I didn't look that dangerous. Maybe only if you could call having long hair and dressing as a hippie fashion of the time dangerous. However, when I began trying to chat with Town Car Man in my normal fashion, with typical small talk, I instantly started getting bad vibes from him. I could tell that he was mostly ignoring everything I was saying, instead kept trying to steer the conversation towards asking me personal questions about myself, how old I was, where I went to school, if I had a girlfriend. I tried to answer his questions as politely as possible, without giving away much real information. Town Car Man just kept getting more and more personal though, asking me questions that hinted at whether or not I was sexually active with my girlfriend, telling me that when he was my age he went around horny about half the time, and had always been on the lookout for sexual adventures. As the ride progressed and we were going further and further out into the country, I began to get very uneasy. I started to sense something was not quite right about this man. We had now left the populated city behind, and were traveling down an old 2-lane highway through the countryside that was sparsely populated. There seemed to be hardly any other cars on the road. The more town car man continued to ask me questions about myself, wanting to know very personal things about me. Like if I ever had sex with my girlfriend, all while glancing over at me from time to time with a sort of creepy knowing look in his eye, as if he was privately enjoying some dirty secret that only he knew about. The more uncomfortable I became. I don't know how to better describe it than that, and it really began to make me feel uneasy. His manner started to get very cagey, and I sensed there was some underlying motive to his questioning. It really put me on edge. I began to think about what I should do next, as in, should I ask him to pull over and just let me out, even though I was only about halfway to my destination, and in the middle of nowhere. For the first time, I began to realize just how vulnerable I felt. What really started to make me feel uneasy, though, was when he started asking me if I wanted a drink of liqueur, indicating that he had several bottles with him in the trunk, and that if I wanted some, he'd pull over to the side of the road and mix me up a stiff drink. Because I was growing more and more uncomfortable, I declined his offer, saying I did not drink. It was a lie even at that age. I was already regularly drinking with friends. He would not take no for an answer, though, and kept insisting I should really have just one drink. After all, he was such a great drink mixer, and it would only take a minute for him to fix a very special one for me. After I had declined his offer for something like the 4th time, he abruptly changed tactics once again. He began telling me a story about when he was about my age, and a young guy in the army, how he used to hitchhike a lot too. He would sometimes get picked up by men who wanted to pay him money to have sex with them, and had anything like that ever happen to me? By this time, I had quite enough of all of this. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, that's never happened to me, and nobody had better offer that offer to me either." That knowing look instantly vanished from his face. I could tell he was totally irked how I had just reacted to his story. That exchange between us totally changed the dynamic inside the car, and he became very quiet. After a few minutes of uneasy silence, he spoke up and told me he was turning in at the next intersection, and I would need to get out from there. Even though he had told me when he first picked me up he was going my entire way. At this point I was very relieved, though. I now only wanted to get out of this car. When the car came to a stop, I had just barely gotten out and pushed the door closed, when he stomped on the gas and zoomed off, literally jerking the handle out of my hand. I remember that I stood there watching him drive away until he disappeared down the road, and my heart was beating very fast. I was both scared and angry at what had just happened. After I calmed down a bit, I resumed hitchhiking, until I got another ride that took me home without further incident. Fast forward 25 years. It's 1999, and I had all but forgotten about my creepy ride with Town Carman. I'm on the internet reading through a true crime website when I stumble onto a story about an ultra creepy guy named Robert Bennett. A man who had been arrested after a series of vicious attacks on men whom he had picked up in his car, drugged, handcuffed, and then set their genitals on fire with a flammable liquid. The attacks took place over a 20-plus year period, starting in 1968 in the Atlanta area and ending with his arrest in 1991. Prior to Bennett's arrest, this attacker became known as the Handcuff Man, and talk within the local gay community was that he was targeting men with whom he thought were gay prostitutes. When I saw the photo of Bennett that accompanied the article, my jaw literally dropped open. The memories of my ride that day in 1974 came flooding right back. I was certain I was looking at a picture of Town Carman, and I was absolutely floored. I don't have any way to prove that the creepy guy who picked me up was in fact this Robert Bennett, but the physical resemblance between what I remember about Town Carman and the photo of Bennett are absolutely uncanny. And the persistent offer to mix me a special drink, his questions about whether or not I ever had sex with men for money, those also seem to indicate that possibility. I should point out that even though this story took place in the early 70s in the deep south of Georgia, I was actually okay with gay people at the time, and even knew a few people who were gay as well. I didn't have a problem with homosexuality at all, and still don't. But being heterosexual, I had zero interest in having sex with other men, and even if I had been game for that sort of thing, I always found it highly distasteful when people assumed they could act in such an unwanted, cagey fashion regarding sexual matters with complete strangers. I always have, and always will find that to be extremely creepy. So, when I was a kid, my family was really close to the across-the-street neighbors. I was outside playing with the daughter when my parents told us they were going to run to the store for a bit. We asked them if we could stay at my house. I had a cool Barbie dream house I wanted to show off to her, as her parents were home right across the street. My parents said yes, and made sure to tell hers to keep an eye out for us. Once we were inside, we were thrilled to have this big house to ourselves. Just like big kids, we made ourselves our own lunch and watched cartoons for a little bit. All of a sudden, though, there's a knock at the door, and this is where the fun begins. Because of the urgency of this knocking, I hopped up immediately and ran for the door, thinking it must be my parents who had forgotten something. After looking through the side window, though, I saw what looked like my friend's brother. I flung the door open. There was a man who was definitely not my friend's dorky 6-foot-tall brother. The man looked extremely jumpy and told me he needed me to come outside right away because he had just accidentally hit my parents' car. I immediately panicked and asked which one. He took a few steps back to look at the driveway and said, "The red one. My mom's prized BMW." Now don't judge me too harshly. I was maybe 9 or 10 or so, and someone had just told me they had ruined the car my mom loved just as much, if not more, than us kids. I blurted out my parents weren't home, and he told me he still needed me to come out and check the damages. Because obviously, as we all know, a 9-year-old can assess the damage to a 1990s convertible very well. I looked back at my friend, and while we chatted with each other to discuss what to do, he reached out to force open the screen door. It was locked, but it was one of those shitty plastic ones that could have easily just been yanked a little hard and pulled open right away. It wasn't until then that my alarm bells finally went off. I told him I had to go call my mom. He started to protest, but I slammed the door shut and immediately called my friend's mom instead. Thankfully, she's a very intimidating lady. She marched right over before we could even finish explaining what was happening. The man was obviously startled by someone arriving so quickly. When she demanded to know why he was at my door in the first place, he started stammering something about selling magazines. Obviously, he didn't have anything with him, so she told him to get lost or she was calling the cops. It was at this point I looked out and noticed a car pull up alongside our house very quickly. He hopped in the passenger side and they sped away in a heartbeat. I think we all came to the realization at the same time that someone had been in a car waiting for him at the top of my street. My friend's mom turned ghost white with recognition, then immediately flushed red with anger. Let's just say we weren't allowed to be home alone for a long time after that. So this is one of many stories my dad told me when I was a little girl about his adventures hitchhiking when he was a few years younger than my age now. I'm 28, by the way. He's a super deadhead. He and a friend named John followed them on the road with nothing but their acoustics and some spare cash they had on hand. Apparently, they had gotten to Georgia at one point and were getting very tired. They still needed to make it a few towns over, though, in order to be able to see the dead the following day. They walked for miles and miles and tried to catch a ride for hours on end to no avail. They had just started to lose hope when this beat-up pickup truck pulled right alongside them and let them in. My dad hopped in the front and John got in the back. John thanked the man profusely for driving them and fell asleep right away. leaving my dad awake and alone with this guy driving. According to him, things were bad right from the start. The driver asked where they were headed to and why they had those guitars with them. He even asked if my dad knew how to play them well. My dad told him about the Grateful Dead and how he did play and usually picked a banjo but had left it back home. The guy leaned in super close and said this, "You know, I've always wanted to kill me one of them guitar boys." My dad started freaking out at this point. He said he just laughed it off but tried to be as unnoticeable as possible while attempting to wake up John in a hurry. Things just kept getting more tense. He asked the guy if he'd mind pulling into a gas station, but he refused. Then he asked how long until they would arrive at the next town over. No response. The man just went completely silent. After a few hours of driving, with John waking up in the meantime, the guy began to get really eccentric. He began asking if they'd ever seen a bad death. He started driving the truck into mailboxes, street signs, and even ran over a stray dog while laughing maniacally. My dad and John just laughed right along with him until he finally pulled over at a gas station and they were able to grab all their things and run off. They ended up missing the show in the end, but I'm glad my dad wasn't the guitar boy that man was looking for. This happened to a friend and I at around 9:30 p.m. on a Saturday, if I recall correctly. I live in an area where not very much goes on. It's always pretty safe for the most part. Anyway, my friend and I are dumb teenagers, both male, that love urban exploring. Our favorite sites to look at are tunnels. Well, around 7:30 p.m. one night, my friend and I were exploring some sites around the park 2 blocks away from our house. It was full of small, empty tunnels to explore. We felt a little weird because we felt as if we weren't there alone. There were a couple of disc golfers around, but we had just watched them leave. At this point, the park was completely empty. My friend and I were just exiting this small tunnel to get back to the park as we were waiting for the disc golfers to leave so we could go to the next secret spot, which were train tracks that were sometimes in use. To get into the tracks, you have to go through an off-path in the woods that has a few curves, so it was very hard to see. My friend would lead the way. A few seconds later, I thought I had lost him though, so I called out his name to find out where he was. Here's when things got weird. I heard what seemed almost like a distant yell or a shout from the train tracks. I thought he had sped up a good ways, so I jogged up ahead and eventually ran into my buddy. He was just around the bend of a curvy turn. I asked him if he was okay. He replied yes, like nothing had happened. A little bit of suspicion ran through my mind, so I asked him why he had yelled at me from the tracks and come back to get me. Shockingly, he didn't. He had been waiting for me just at the turn. He also said he had heard that yell. Well, turns out my friend and I were both idiots. Instead of going back, we quietly continued on to the tracks. When we got up to the bridge with the train tracks, there was absolutely no one and nothing up there. We still felt like we were being watched from the trees or something, though. I let my friend know about this feeling, and we quickly stopped throwing rocks into the creek and headed back to the park. I could tell something was very wrong as we were leaving. I just couldn't put my finger on what it was. We played around on the basketball court at the park before we decided to finally leave. Due to this creepy vibe and feeling of being watched, my friend and I decided it was best to take the main road back instead of the shortcut through the woods that led to our neighborhood. It was around 9:30 now. My friend and I were talking about what we should do for the rest of the night since he was going to be staying over. The park had this big soccer field across the street from it, so it had 2 gravel parking lots that were sort of hidden by trees. As we were walking past one of these gravel lots, I immediately felt what seemed like a warning sign from my body. I tried to pass it off as nothing, but as we crossed the street from the gravel lot, things started getting really creepy. I could just barely see someone come out of the shadows of that gravel lot. They appeared to be wearing very dark clothing, and a hoodie completely covered up their face. I was seeing red flags everywhere. The way they had just come out of nowhere was so subtle and perfectly timed. It was as if they were waiting for us to cross to start following us. My friend, it seemed, hadn't noticed this strange figure yet. I told him to jog up ahead just a little. He seemed confused, so I pulled him close to me and told him what I had just seen. He seemed very anxious now, so he picked up the pace a little. Every once in a while, I would look over my shoulder to see where that figure was. Every time I looked back, though, it would be at least 3 feet closer to us. I could hear the figure's eerie breathing even at one point. Thank God we were close to an alleyway shortcut that no one really uses, but me and my friends. To get to it, you have to go up a little hill to the left of our street. I saw this as an opportunity. I mumbled into my friend's ear, "Let's use the alley." He quickly agreed. The second we made it to the hill, we casually jogged up to the alleyway. I told my friend to wait for a second. I peeked over the street from the alley, and there I saw them. What appeared to be a man in his late 30s, making his way towards us very quickly. I could see his eyes now. They were staring directly at me with this evil look. I told my friend to bolt up the damn alley to his house, which was connected to it. We had never run so fast in our lives. We made it up the street and took a sharp turn to the left. It seemed we had lost the man at this point. We sprinted through his front door and locked every single entrance up tight. We turned off all the lights too, and hid for what felt like an hour. Thank God that man following us was nowhere to be seen. I never saw that man again, and I hope I never do either. This encounter happened to my best friend and I sometime back in 2007 or 2008 or so. We were both women in our early 20s and sharing an apartment in a major metro area. It wasn't a small town, but it was not a big city quite yet either. Through the short stretch of woods behind our apartment complex, there was a neighborhood of single-family homes. Typical suburban cul-de-sac American middle-class neighborhood. Except this neighborhood was completely unoccupied. Like I said, it was around 07-08, so the effects of the American recession were still in full swing. A developer had bought up the neighborhood and all the houses to tear them down. They had also built a shiny new street from the main road to the neighborhood, but the money probably ran out before the homes could actually be bulldozed. At least that's my best guess, because there were several stalled construction projects in the area that had met the same fate. There was nothing in the immediate area in the way of shops, stores, or gas stations, just empty residential homes. It was a bit eerie, but nothing overtly creepy, I guess. Being young, adventurous, and having some daytime hours free due to our retail jobs, my bestie and I liked to go on walks in this abandoned neighborhood. There was this short gravel path through some woods. Then you came out onto the main neighborhood street, which started out gravel and turned into asphalt toward the nicer end of the neighborhood, with the bigger, newer houses. We'd walk up and down shooting the shit, maybe surreptitiously hitting a joint, just being young and carefree. One of the homes looked to have a few acres of land, and there was this big field where we'd take out blankets and go lay down sometimes. On the day this encounter takes place, the sun was shining brightly, and there was a brilliant blue sky, probably late summer or early fall, I can't quite remember. It was broad daylight though. Like I said earlier, the neighborhood was a bit eerie, but on that day we felt completely safe. We were on our midway abandoned neighborhood stroll when we noticed something we had never seen before. A car on the street headed in our direction. It was the first time we had ever seen a vehicle there. It was this small blue hatchback. I don't know cars very well, so that's the most specific description I can give. Neither one of us could really get a good look at the driver's face, but we could see there were 2 people in the car. The only thing I could make out was that the driver was male, white, had brown hair, and was wearing a blue shirt. The car rumbled past us on the gravel road and out of sight. We continued on, thinking it was odd, but not really that weird. A couple of minutes later, though, the car came back from the direction it had just come, passing us from behind. It drove just out of sight over this little hill. We figured maybe they'd gotten turned around. Since obviously there was nothing of interest on this road except this abandoned subdivision, we continued our walk for another couple of minutes. We reached the hill, and as we get to the top, we see the car that had just driven past us. It was stopped on the road just a little ways ahead of us, just sitting there with its brake lights on. That's when I noticed the person in the passenger side seat was now gone. I found this odd. I started internally questioning whether I'd ever seen the passenger at all, until my friend said, "Hey, wasn't there another person?" My hackles started to go up. I was creeped out at this point. Something about the way that car just sat there idling, like they were waiting for us. There was nothing of interest behind us where he could have dropped his passenger off, which made their now absence very unsettling. I don't know how long we were standing there staring at this car, possibly with the driver's accomplice having been dropped off behind us or something, and the car lying in wait in front of us. It felt like forever. I had a cold, heavy feeling in my stomach. My friend and I were both frozen on the spot, hair on the back of our necks standing straight up and mental alarm bells ringing. It was dawning on me that we had not told anyone where we were. I was standing there frozen in fear, brain frantically trying to figure out how long it would be until my boyfriend would get off work and discover us missing. The car started backing towards us fast. It shot back towards us. My friend and I came to our senses and tore off towards the woods, cutting through the backyard of one of the abandoned houses. We frantically bushwhacked our way through the short stretch of woods and came out on the opposite side of our apartment complex. We ran like hell until we finally reached our building. I have no idea what that driver was doing, or what their intentions were, or where his passenger disappeared to. Nor do I know why he tried to reverse into us. I used to work mid-shifts for a couple of years. I would get off work at around 2 a.m., be at the parking lot in the building basement by around 2:30 or 3. This one time, when I got off the elevator, there was this man wearing the maintenance uniform sweeping the floor. He was not the usual guy, though, that I would see when getting off my shift. I was friends with all of the guards, receptionists, and maintenance people at my building, you see. I would always bring them a coffee from our pantry and sometimes even the occasional packed bread from our vending machine. I wasn't quite sure who this new guy was, but for some reason I was immediately creeped out by him, maybe because I couldn't see his face at all. He had shoulder-length black hair that was covering his entire face, so instead of giving him the coffee I was holding, I decided instead to walk straight to my car. I could hear the sound of my heels clicking on the floor, and then I began to hear a second set of footfalls. I walked faster, and noticed that whoever was following me now walked faster too. Then I started to run. My car has keyless entry, so I just pushed the button and literally jumped right in. I slammed the door closed, and clicked the remote lock button to lock the car. I looked over, and saw that new maintenance guy. He was smiling at me, trying to pull open my car door and pressing his face against my window. He wasn't saying a single thing, only smiling while trying to open my car. Now my car is set to go on alarm if the door was locked using the remote and was started from the inside. I proceeded to start the engine and the alarm started going off like crazy. The guy immediately stopped trying to open my door, stood ram straight, gave me a salute, and walked slowly away. After what felt like hours, the building guard and the maintenance guy that were usually assigned to my parking floor approached my car. They were surprised to find me inside. Coffee spilled all over me while I sobbed. I told them what had just happened. Neither one of them knew who the guy I was describing was. After that incident, there were more guards assigned to the parking areas, now doing rounds hourly. I never saw that guy anymore, and I hope to never see him again. This also made me act more carefully whenever I go out into any parking area. I always keep a can of pepper spray handy, and added a whistle on my ID lanyard and bag straps for added precaution. Today, there was a test of the civil defense siren in the region I live in. The sound of it brought back a memory of something I've not thought about for many years now. Now, in my country, it's common for these sirens to be placed on school buildings, so it was very memorable the few times of year those would be tested. Back when I was in middle school at the age of 14, I was like most other kids my age, just trying to fit in. In my case, that meant I was trying to blend into the crowd of the school's older emo kids. I was attending a creative course, and because the entire school ground was getting renovated, there were multiple old buildings that were going to be demolished. Because of this, I and some other emo kids were pretty much allowed to do whatever we wanted with those buildings for an art project and for the upcoming school fair. We were painting random stuff on the walls and painting the stairs into waterfalls and such. On this day, we were getting close to the end of our project. It was the end of the day, so school was pretty much empty, and the sirens were going to be tested that day. Funnily enough, those sirens that probably originated way back from World War II were placed on top of the abandoned school building where said event was going to happen. Among the emo kids, there was this guy who was a few years older than me that I always found very weird. His name was Paul. The only way to describe him really is that it was like he was constantly pretending to be unpredictable and batshit crazy just to get a laugh. Most of the time, this just meant that he was clowning around. He was friends with this other emo guy my age, Andrew, who was openly obsessed with me. He was a very annoying daily thing I had to deal with, who constantly followed me around school, saying weird sexual stuff and sniffing my hair. But despite this stalkerish behavior, it never went past that. Soon though, Paul had joined in on Andrew following me around, so I skipped school a lot because no one ever wanted to take me seriously. They thought I was just being whiny about this comedic duo of pursuers. Even my own mother would laugh if I complained about it. Despite them both being creepy and annoying though, I felt a bit bad for them, because Andrew was always getting bullied for being feminine and gay, even though he clearly was not given how he acted around me. And I felt bad for Paul because I knew he came from a very tragic and troubled home. Anyway, I was walking downstairs from where some of my friends were painting, to the empty first floor so I could go outside the building. The sirens had just started. It was so loud it was impossible to hear anything except during the small breaks between. Suddenly, someone grabbed me before I managed to get outside and moved me into this other hallway where a wall blocked any view from the entrance of the building. This person held his hands in front of my mouth as he pushed me and lifted me up against the brick wall there. I was so shocked I was kind of winded. He faced me, and I saw it was that weirdo Paul, who for the record was very tall compared to my tiny frame. The sirens were sounding off loudly. He didn't say a single thing. He just stared at me with these crazy eyes. Back then, I was completely innocent. The fact he could do anything bad to me he wanted did not cross my mind right away. I just nervously laughed and said that he'd scared me, and asked him to please put me down. But he didn't. I was starting to freak out, because I knew no one could hear me, and nobody knew where I was either. Just then though, luckily, before anything could happen to me, this older emo girl who was one of my friends appeared peeking out of the corner. It turned out she had already been looking for me. When she saw what was going on here though, she didn't hesitate for a moment. She walked over screaming at Paul, and kicked him as hard as she could right in the knee. He dropped me immediately as he crouched down in pain. My friend grabbed my shoulder and brought me outside to the schoolyard. After, we didn't really talk about it, just called him a creep and laughed it off together. During my last few years in middle school, I drifted away from that crowd. They were all older now and moving on to high school. As I've grown older and wiser, I came to realize just how close I came to something really bad happening to me back then. Because of the sirens, no one would have been able to hear me scream, and because we were in that abandoned building, There were a lot of secluded rooms he could have dragged me into. I'm so thankful that my old friend walked in before he had the chance to hurt me. Without her, the story might have ended very differently. Lastly, I'd like to add that I saw this guy again in high school because he was dating a friend of a friend. She was a year younger than me, meaning she was about 16 and him 19. He would often wait around school grounds for her to finish classes, and even though I tried to avoid him, he ran up and hugged me once. I felt very uncomfortable and sort of froze. After that, I told my friend that he was not a right person, and she said she knew, because he was very abusive to his girlfriend as well. Several years ago, when I was 25, I lived with, at the time, one of my best friends. Our friendship eventually started to dwindle though, as it usually goes when you move in with a good friend, so she was rarely home. This night, however, she ended up staying at our place heading to bed early. I was a server at the time, so I stayed up pretty late usually, watching YouTube and smoking pot. This night was no different than any other, except for the fact that my neighbors tried to kidnap me. I'll go ahead and give you some background info on my house and my neighbors. We lived in a 3-bedroom house with 2 bedrooms and the kitchen facing the crazy neighbors. They were a younger couple living in a smaller mill house. They were constantly coming to our door asking for handouts. Now, normally I'd be very happy to help a neighbor out, but they would come over and ask for crazy shit, like for us to fill up a Mountain Dew bottle with water because theirs just got shut off, beer, and once literally to ask for a single dollar. They would just be constantly knocking at our door to ask for help with these minuscule things. And when we wouldn't answer, I'd peek through the window and see them either jacking cigarette butts from the ashtray or pressing their eyeballs up against the door peephole to see if they could spot us inside. Anyway, there I was smoking some weed and watching YouTube on my couch when I heard a knock at the door. I rolled my eyes because I knew exactly who had just come a-knockin'. It was 11 p.m. by the way. I decided to check the peephole, and sure enough, the boyfriend was on my porch. Normally, I just walk away and continue on with my life, but this time he looked like he was in genuine distress. I opened the door to see what was wrong. "Hey, I just wanted to come over here and see if you would film my engagement. I got my girlfriend a ring here in my pocket, and I need you to follow me to my backyard and film it for me." Baffled but curious, I told him congratulations and said I'd be out in just a second. I just needed to put my shoes on. I shut the door behind me and locked it. Quickly, I ran to the back room that looked out into their backyard. I peeked through the blinds to see what setup he had for his girlfriend. Nothing. Pitch black darkness. No sign of any decorations or anything like that. Naturally, I woke my roommate up and told her what was going on. Yeah, fuck that," she said to me. We both walked back up to the door after the boyfriend started banging on it furiously. I looked through the peephole again. I couldn't see anything and was confused, all the way until he pulled his eyeball away from the door hole. I quickly turned around and put my back up against the door. My roommate came running back to me from her room, manning 2 wire hangers for protection. We clung on to those hangers for dear life and sat against the door until he finally stopped pounding and left. We were completely freaked out, but we wanted to make sure we weren't overreacting. We went out our back door and hopped into her car so we could do a slow drive-by. They always had their front door open and also didn't have any blinds, so it was very easy to see into their house. Slowly, we crept by in her car and peered into their living room. Sitting on the couch and staring at the wall, looking strung out, was the couple and this older man. We sped off and ended up staying at a friend's house that night. I never answered the door for either of them ever again. One day, I came home from work and an older lady was parked in their driveway. She walked up to me as I got out of my car and asked if I knew where the neighbors were. I told her I hadn't seen them for a while, and she informed me she was the owner. She had told me they were months late on rent and she had finally come to evict them. She entered the home to find it completely trashed, needles and garbage everywhere, holes in the wall and literal shit on the floor. I told her I was sorry to hear she had to deal with all of that stuff, but I was very happy they were now finally gone. I'm not 100% sure what was going on that night, but I'm glad I didn't follow him to that backyard. Background: I was 26 at the time, pregnant, and I live in a very rural area. Tom had always been friends with my friends throughout high school. He was the quiet art kid who had insane natural talent. He always seemed nice enough, but despite always wearing a smile, he just gave people, girls mostly, the feeling that something was off about him. I never spent a lot of one-on-one time with him because of this, but I also never really had any reason to believe he was dangerous at all, just a bit weird. Anyway, years after high school, I reconnect with my high school sweetheart Jamie, who happens to be best friends with Tom. Everything was going great for Jamie and I. We got married, started a family, were remodeling an old home on acres of land that was our own. The dream. By then, Tom had become a regular at gatherings. I noticed more and more that he had this weapons fascination, and also liked to brag about himself. Obnoxious, but still nothing that made me feel very threatened. Tom, by this time, had also married a woman, except she was old enough to be his mother. These two were not a healthy, cohesive couple. Super codependent, manipulative, and apparently even got physical with one another. In the midst of this, Tom started drinking and lying about it too, getting 2 DWIs, and even showing up at our house drunk. Jamie eventually told him to just show up sober or don't bother coming at all. I was about 3 months pregnant at the time, and he didn't want all that drama at our house. Time goes by with no word from Tom. That is, until about 3 months since his last visit. He calls my husband wanting to chat and sounding very depressed. I was about 6 months along at this time. Jamie had him come by and they chatted outside. Turns out Tom wanted to leave his wife. Good for him. But something wasn't quite right, even more so than normal. Jamie snuck to Tom's scooter while Tom came inside to use our restroom. He found Tom's stashed bottle of vodka. While Jamie was outside, Tom all of a sudden didn't have to use the restroom anymore. Instead, he turned to me and looked me up and down, so cold and expressionless. You know, Jess, women are the most beautiful when they're pregnant, and you've never been more gorgeous. He made a move to get closer to me, but by this time, Jamie was walking in. Come outside, we need to talk. Shortly afterwards, I heard Tom leave. Jamie came to tell me about the alcohol. I told him about the creepy moment, and we both agreed that from then on he could no longer be trusted. He would not be welcome here until he got help. Well, instead of getting help, Tom stopped calling. No texts, nothing. Jamie reached out to make sure he was okay, but it would never get a response. From what we heard from his family, he was doing fine though, just working and staying busy trying to keep sober. We really hoped he was taking better care of himself. 2 months later, at 8 months pregnant, I was no longer working preterm labor, and Jamie works 6 days a week. That was a lot of time alone. His schedule was always the same and had not changed in years, so when Tom randomly showed up at our house at 10 a.m. on a day he knew Jamie worked, I was very confused. I usually napped around that time because I was huge and tired. Luckily, I was awake this time and in our front room though. The room has a huge window that faces our driveway, and the door to my right leads to our garage. I shot him a nervous wave through my window. He didn't seem to see me though, and was grabbing something out of a duffel bag on his scooter. He pulled out a shotgun. I know there's fight or flight, but I just froze. He also grabbed a bottle and took a huge swig from it, guessing whiskey because of the bottle and color. Then he finally noticed me. Sheer horror on my face. In return, I got a hateful look. He said something I couldn't hear, then smiled. Not a happy smile either. He packed up his gun and left. I immediately called Jamie. He worked close by and police took forever to get to where we live. He didn't answer. I text, totally freaked out while checking all the locks. Jamie calls back about 10 minutes later, and as we're talking, Jamie's dad, who lives just down the road, calls. Tom just tried to break into his house. Thankfully, Jamie's dad is always armed. He caught him red-handed, but didn't call the cops because of their long-standing friendship with Tom's family. Apparently, Tom didn't have his gun out when he was caught, so Jamie's dad didn't feel threatened enough to call the cops. Not exactly happy about that, but it wasn't my choice. Don't worry, I called the cops myself later that day. This event alone was scary and super confusing, but what Jamie told me later really freaked me out. When I was working, I worked a set schedule, except for occasionally I'd be called in. One day, a month prior to my incident, Jamie called in sick, and I coincidentally was called in to work. I hated leaving him sick, but duty called. Jamie said he had been napping a little after 9 due to a high fever. He had awoken at some point to the sound of doors opening and closing, but figured he was so out of it must have just been his fever. What woke him up and kept him at least semi-alert, though, was the bell on our bedroom door. He heard it jingle twice lightly. He vaguely remembers looking up and seeing what looked like Tom at the end of our bed staring at him. He said he passed out from the fever getting worse and came to not very long afterward. By then, Tom was long gone, so Jamie figured it was all just a fever dream messing with him. After the gun incident, though, he wasn't so sure anymore. It's been over 2 years since then, and we make no attempts to talk to Tom any longer. He used to drive by from time to time, but never tried to make any contact either. That has since stopped, but I make sure to lock all of my windows and doors throughout the day. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors, close enough to not feel isolated. The area had no streetlights though, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking out the moonlight. This didn't really bother me though. Actually, it made my house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a very cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, though, I immediately caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was very odd, as I had never smelled that before around the house. I didn't see anyone nearby, though, so I ignored that smell and went inside. I had just gotten off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I was extremely tired. Even though it wasn't even 7 o'clock yet, I decided to take a shower and call it a night right away. I was abruptly woken sometime later, sure that I had just heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work. On his way to his night classes, I had even given him a spare key so he could stop by if I wasn't home. He would always text to let me know beforehand though, and I had never heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text and maybe I'd just missed it or something. The bright light from my phone's screen and number pad blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark. This particular phone was so bright I could even use it as a flashlight by itself. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was around 9-something, but I couldn't really tell yet if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and called out my friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before I heard loud footfalls as someone started sprinting through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed by instinct and ran over to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one I was in and a spare, and a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway, right past my door and into the bathroom. Thank God he did that. That gave me just enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were just barely inside the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back out into the hallway and into the other room, which just had stacked boxes in a corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom, because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic, just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was from about their knees down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and worn work boots. After a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away, and I heard a loud crash coming from my room, followed by screams of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be put in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. The man in my house ran back down the stairs. I could hear the crashes and clatters of random things as they were thrown around, and furniture was knocked all over the place. I stayed crouched there in the attic. I had left my cell phone down there when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without him hearing me. After some time, the noises finally stopped. I started counting very slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was that the intruder had flipped my bed completely over, I assume in an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise I had heard after he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone anywhere, so I went to the landline by the bed and called the cops. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a complete mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped. All the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all the boxed and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said people often use to smoke meth, so they think he had been watching my house for a long while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me I should stay with family or friends that night and get the door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day, I called to have the door fixed and the motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic as well and added a landline there. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing else really happened in that house, though. I lived there another 3 years without any more incident. One more precaution I took, though, was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet, and climbing into the attic as quietly and quickly as possible. I even kept at this when I moved, except now I would go into a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened had I been just a bit slower getting to the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first. When I was in 8th grade, my parents separated. Basically, my mom packed her and I up one night and we moved into my grandpa's and never looked back. We ended up living there through my high school years when he died. My parents officially got divorced, my mom remarried, and we moved into the city with my stepfather. My grandpa lived on the first floor of the apartment, and the owners, an elderly couple who were family to us through marriage, lived on the second floor. The property also had a small in-law cottage out in the back where my uncle lived. For some reason that I will never understand, there was no lock to get into the actual building if you entered through the back. The back door opened into a landing where there was a locked and dead-bolted door to our apartment, and then 2 sets of stairs. One led up to the locked and also dead-bolted door of the second-floor apartment, and the other led down to the basement, where there was also no lock. Our apartment could also be entered from the front of the building, but in order to access the second-floor apartment or the basement, you had to go through this landing. The basement was actually pretty nice, and at one point they had even started to convert it into its own apartment, before they ultimately decided to make the in-law cottage instead. So, in the basement there was a full kitchen, complete with an oven, sink, and refrigerator. The washer and dryer, which was shared by all of us, was also there in that basement as well. There was also just some general storage stuff lying around too. The basement was entirely open, except for a back room that was full of storage. It had one of those swinging saloon-type doors where you could see above and beneath them. The storage area was longer than it was deep, so you couldn't really see anything much behind the door aside from shelves. You had to walk into the room and turn to really see the rest of it. One night when I was in high school, I think I was around 15 or so at the time, after taking a shower, I saw that the laundry bin in the bathroom was pretty full, so I grabbed a ton of laundry and headed down towards that basement. It was pretty late at night, but I figured I would at least get it started and move some things over in the morning. I tossed everything onto the ground and started sorting out the colors from the whites when I got hit with this horrible feeling in my gut. This basement was not at all a creepy basement. It was well lit and pretty welcoming with the kitchen and everything. But for some reason I couldn't quite explain, something felt really wrong. Anyone who's ever been hit with the feeling that they were being watched knows exactly what I'm talking about. I don't know how or why it came over me, but it was a feeling I just couldn't shake. I found myself looking over to the saloon doors, the only part of the basement I could not see in its entirety. I don't know why, maybe just to assure myself I was being a big baby. I started to walk towards the back room. I managed to stop myself just as I reached out towards those swinging doors. I've been a horror fan as long as I can remember, and had seen more horror movies than I could even count. I knew that if this was a movie, I would be calling myself a dumbass and saying not to go into that back room. I quickly snapped my hand back and ran up the stairs, leaving all the clothes behind. I ran into our apartment where I locked the doors and immediately told my mom that I just had the worst feeling in the basement and I was super creeped out. Despite me not being the type of person that scares easily, she basically rolled her eyes at me and told me to go to bed. I ended up doing as I was told, though it took me a bit to shake the feeling and finally fall asleep. Later that night, my bladder woke me up and I stumbled out of my room to go to the bathroom. I didn't turn any of the lights on as I started making my way towards the bathroom because it usually woke up my grandpa and I didn't want to bother him. As I got closer though, I noticed my mom standing in the doorway of her bedroom. Something looked off, and it took me a moment to realize that she was clutching the phone. She then noticed me and whispered to me to get against the wall, which I did without hesitation. It took a few moments for the grogginess to wear off, and my eyes to adjust to the darkness before I could see what she did. My mom's bedroom was immediately off the kitchen. The kitchen was where the back door that led to the landing and basement was located. The door had a tiny window up top with a small but thick curtain. It was thin enough that you could see that someone was outside the door, but thick enough to not be able to make out any features of the person on the other side. There was someone on the other side of the door, and every now and then the doorknob would turn gently. You could hear the scratching sound on the other side, too. I had never been so afraid in my entire life. I'm not sure how I managed to do what I did next. It was like someone else had taken control over me entirely. I slid down against the wall that I was clinging to and started to crawl against it in the darkness toward the kitchen. My mom looked petrified, watching back and forth between me and the back door. She kept whispering for me to stop and go back, but I kept moving forward, low and against the wall, toward the counter where I carefully grabbed a butcher knife. I was shaking the whole time I moved with the knife in my hand on the ground next to the fridge, which was next to the door the man was trying to get into. I had this horrible feeling I was going to be killed, but if I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I sat there forever in the darkness next to the door, with my mom hiding in the bedroom doorway across from me, just waiting. It was only for a few minutes. My mom had already called 911 before I had woken up and stumbled my way toward the bathroom. The lights from the approaching squad cars soon filled the kitchen, and from the other side of the door I could hear a sudden clamoring and commotion, the slam of the back screen bursting open as the would-be assailant took off sprinting into the night. It was around 3 a.m. when this happened, so it was completely dark outside. We lived right by some train tracks and very thick bushes and trees too, that made it very easy for the man to escape the cop that pursued him. The police came in and took statements from my mom and I. My grandpa, who was partially deaf, had managed to sleep through almost the entire thing until the police came through to search the apartment and make sure we were okay. The outside of the door and doorknob were both covered in deep scratches, like someone had been going at it with a knife trying to figure out how to get in. But that wasn't the most horrifying part to me. That was reserved for the basement. The clothes that I had brought down were not where I had left them, and had been thrown about and disheveled. The back room, the one with the swinging door that I had stopped myself from going into, the boxes that were out of view had also been thrown about, all opened, obviously gone through with some things missing. There were some wrappers from food on the floor, too. He had been down there looking for something to steal. He was down there when I went down to do laundry. I had almost walked into that room on my own, and based on what we had seen on the door, he had a knife with him, too. To this day, I can't help but find myself sometimes thinking about what may have happened if I had walked into that room that day. This happened back while I was in college a couple of years ago. Me and my roommate moved into a beautiful apartment our junior year of college. Our parents made it extremely clear that two small females living alone together was not ideal for some of the cheaper, shady neighborhoods close to our college. We attended a college in our state capital, so we were in a city environment. They had certain criteria we had to meet in order for us to live there, and for them to co-sign our leases. Lit sidewalks, key to entry into the building, lit parking lot, X blocks from campus, etc., etc. Eventually, we finally found one that fit our parents' criteria. Our apartment building had a key to entry for both the front of the building and the back gate that led to the fire escape. Our apartment was also an end unit that led to the fire escape, so there were 2 deadbolt locks on it. We loved this apartment. We felt safe, we had fun, we were truly living the college experience. And then my roommate's boyfriend started slowly moving his things into the apartment, and staying there way more often than he should be. I finally told my roommate that if he wanted to stay here, use the water, electric, and food I helped pay for, then he needed to pay for it too, including our rent. I told her, a 3-way split, where I'm paying only my rent and he can pay the entire electric, water, and trash bill. I thought I was being pretty fair, honestly, and even though her boyfriend didn't have a job, that was not my problem. I work and go to college. Your "I don't want to work at McDonald's" excuse was completely garbage. If you want a place to stay, then to the Golden Arches you shall go, buddy. Instead, my roommate started sneaking him in really late at night after I went to sleep, and he left on days I'd stay home. While I was in class, he was there. Then he would leave before I would come back. My schedule was extremely routine. Well, he can't have a key, so if my roommate is in class or at work, how is he getting in? He can't take my roommate's key because he decides to leave halfway through the day, so how would she get her key back? All good questions. The solution they came up with is to leave the back door unlocked that led to the fire escape. That way he could just jump the fence at the bottom of the fire escape to get back onto it when he was ready to come back, or stick a rock in between the door. Whatever worked for him, I guess. So, I'm off of work and school one Thursday morning. I decide I'm going to sleep in as long as I possibly can. My roommate and her boyfriend had already left for the day, so naturally they left the door unlocked that day as well. I'm asleep like a pretty princess. It's about 10 in the morning when I hear the back door open to the apartment. I come to just enough to recognize the noise, realize it's probably my roommate or her boyfriend, and brush it off and try to drift back to sleep. All of a sudden, though, I start hearing someone creeping through the apartment through the wooden floors. It definitely didn't sound like casual, comfortable walking. It was clearly someone stepping slowly and quietly through my apartment. The door to my room was ajar just a sliver, but I didn't see anything out through it. I'm honestly too tired to get up and look. A couple of minutes passed by and I figured that my roommate and or her boyfriend were just being weirdos and I could safely fall back asleep. I can't be sure how much time passed before I opened my eyes again, but it couldn't have been too long. I wake up to the sight of my door slowly opening. My back is to the door and I'm facing the opposing wall. I slowly start to turn over to see why my roommate or her boyfriend would dare wake me up from my slumber. And there he is, a burglar, in my room next to the bed I'm currently laying in. A 6-foot-tall, 250-pound burglar, unplugging my TV 5 feet away from me. I immediately pretended I was just shifting positions in my sleep and continued to roll over with my eyes as shut as I could make them seem, still open enough to watch what was going on though. He heard me shuffling as I turned over, stopped, and looked dead at me. Luckily, he didn't seem to realize my eyes were open just a tiny bit. He goes back to unplugging my TV, my DVD player, and shoves it in a bag he's brought, like those bags from IKEA. He steals my change jar too, and casually starts walking out the front door of my apartment, like he just came in for a cup of fucking tea or something. After I hear the door shut, I immediately spring out of bed, grab my phone, and start dialing 911, all while locking the front and back doors. The dispatcher is trying to calm me down. At this point, I'm hysterical. I can't even catch my breath to tell her okay. Luckily, I told her my address before I started hyperventilating. Pause. I'll take a second to commend the police department, both city and college, because they were there in less than 3 minutes. Resume. She tells me the cops are there, but they need me to go downstairs to let them in the building because they don't have the key to the front door. I was so afraid to open the door to my apartment, I even looked down the hallway. I'm about to walk to the front door and extend my arm out to the handle when I hear, "Ma'am, it's the police." As if I didn't get scared enough already, they just yell through the door. I'm paranoid because the dispatcher just told me they couldn't get in and didn't realize someone probably let them in downstairs. I asked the dispatcher to confirm that the people at my door were actually police officers. Thankfully, she told me they were. Okay, cool. I open the front door and collapse right there. My legs just completely turn into jello and I hit the floor. I blacked out for a brief period of time, but they helped me up and sat me down on the couch. There was at least 10 officers in my apartment, from both the city and college departments. When I look outside the living room to the street below, too, there are 5 or 6 cop cars blocking the street. I was being bombarded with questions now. I had to try and find out what was missing beside the stuff from my room. I was crying, shaking. This is not at all how I saw my day off going. I tell them my roommate left the back door open for her boyfriend. They inspect the back door, blah blah blah. The next thing I know, my roommate and her boyfriend walk in, and they both had the most dumbfounded looks on both their faces. At this point, now there's a detective talking to me, and I'm giving my statement, giving a description of the burglar, the stuff missing, looking at mug shots. I immediately stop talking to this detective, look up at both of them, and blurt out, "Someone robbed us while I was asleep. He came into my room, you know." My roommate looked me dead in the face and said, "Oh God, is any of my stuff gone?" That's what you're asking me right now? If your replaceable shit is missing. What a bitch. The 2 officers take her and her boyfriend aside and talk to them while I'm finishing up with the detective. I call my then boyfriend and he comes over to help me pack my stuff up to stay over at his house for a couple of days, which turned into me staying until my lease at my place ended, around 4 months. After failing to recognize any of the suspects in the lineup, the cops slowly started leaving. After they all left, I called my parents to tell them what happened, gathered my things, and headed over to my boyfriend's house. My roommate and her boyfriend never once apologized, not for leaving the door unlocked, but just a general "I'm sorry this happened to you" type thing. They never asked me if I was okay, if I wanted to talk, nothing. The day my lease ended was the best day of that entire year. I couldn't wait to get away from my roommate, or boyfriend, in that apartment. They never found the guy who robbed me that day. I didn't even really care about the materialistic things. He robbed me of my safety and security, and it took a good amount of counseling to get that back. I'm also thankful he didn't try to attack me that morning. My friendship with my roommate was of course tarnished. I haven't spoken to her since. And to this day, I don't sleep with my back to the door, and I always keep a knife under my mattress. So this has been happening for about a year and a half now, and tonight something happened that finally made me and my boyfriend realize I wasn't just imagining it all. About a year and a half ago, after living in my apartment for over 5 years, I very suddenly started noticing that things would be out of place when I would get home from work. Things almost seemed to be out of place purposefully, as if to mess with my OCD specifically. I would sometimes notice knives that were put back in the knife block the wrong way, or little ornaments that I have around my house being turned to face a different direction. Sometimes my clothes would be hung up in the closet the wrong way too. Little things like that where I could feel something was off, but there was really no way to prove that it was. In all honesty, it could have just been me being absent-minded when putting things away. After a couple of months of things randomly being out of place, though, and always having that creeped-out feeling, things suddenly stopped going out of place. I put it into the back of my mind and stopped being so paranoid, and tried to move on with my life. That is, until about 2 weeks ago. For the past couple of weeks, you see, my cat has been seriously trying to tell me something when I've gotten home from work. Any of you who have a cat will know that exact meow. It's not an "I'm hungry" or "I'm pissed because you've been at work all day" type of thing, but more like a "oh my god, you'll never believe what happened" type of thing, if that makes sense. I didn't really think anything of it though because, well, cats can be jerks sometimes. I assumed he was just bored and wanting to complain about something. The other day when I came home from work, I noticed a pair of balled-up socks that didn't belong to me sitting on my bedroom floor. My boyfriend came over the next night, and I told him he had left a pair of socks here when he stayed over on the weekend. He looked over at those socks and immediately said they were not his. My heart sunk, and so did his. We both knew that someone had been coming into my house again, and that I wasn't imagining it the first time. A few days later, I came home from work and found a bag from a lingerie store on top of my couch. It was empty. This bag had come from inside my house, as I had just bought a bathing suit from that store a couple of weeks prior, and the receipt was in the bag as well. At first I thought my cat may have dragged it there, but upon inspecting there were no teeth marks. As well, my cat couldn't have opened my closet door and gone into the paper and cardboard recycling that I kept up there on the top shelf. The final and most perhaps unsettling thing happened just tonight. My boyfriend met me after work, and we went out for dinner. We went back to my apartment after. I went to unlock my door when I noticed that it was already unlocked. Locking the door when I leave the house is one thing I am the most OCD about. I don't just double and triple check it, I quadruple check it, sometimes even more. It's not just a habit that I have, but something deeply ingrained into my being. Everyone who knows me knows this about me, as I even do it to their doors as well. I have to check 4 or more times or I get this very icky feeling. So because of this, my boyfriend was immediately on red alert when he noticed my door was unlocked. We entered my house, and I was checking to see if anything was out of place. He ran to the sliding glass door and tugged on it. and it opened right up. I never leave that door unlocked. He witnessed me lock it on Sunday when I closed the door because it was getting too cold. He saw me check it 4 times. I had not opened it since then. We're both convinced somebody has been in my house. Whoever has been coming in somehow must have a key. The fact they left the sliding door unlocked makes me think maybe they were coming back with ill intentions. If they have a key, why would they need to unlock the sliding door? Unless they don't want to be identified by the security cameras at the front door of the building. Either way, I have already ordered a security system, but unfortunately it's not going to arrive for a few days. Any suggestions on anything I can do in the meantime to keep safe? And what do you guys think? Am I just being paranoid, or should I go with my gut on this one?